Right.
Excellent. Welcome and hello, everybody, to the Novocastrian Presents. We'll have two men of renown on the show today. We'll have Ralph Ellis, who is an eminent scientist and historian. And we have Caleb Lamont, who is a man of renown in his own right. Hello, Ralph Ellis, Caleb Lamont. How are you doing tonight?
Very well, thank you. Good to be with you. So thanks for inviting me on the show. I think we've got quite a few interesting topics to discuss tonight. So hopefully everyone will be suitably interested in this little discussion.
That's right. Ralph, you've been to Egypt, you've been to ancient Turkey, you've been to so many places to find the treasure that make up the body of your work. You've written many books out of this research: Jesus, King of Edessa, Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, Cleopatra to Christ, the Grail cipher, and Thoth, Architect of the Universe. Why is your work so original? And give us a rundown of your method, please, because this is one of the first things people ask when they find out about your ideas. And give us an overview of what you've discovered about the King of Edessa named Jesus.
Yeah. Yes, it's been an interesting expedition, as it were, over a whole lifetime. So I've been doing this for 40 years. Yeah, how did I get into this? Well, my father was interested in religion and history, so he used to take us round as kids. We must have visited every cathedral in Britain and quite a few of them in Europe. That sort of gave me an interest, but I was not religious. I rejected religion at a very early age. So I was able to look at this very dispassionately from a sort of agnostic viewpoint. And at that early age, of course, people used to say, because I was in a Church of England school, you know, it was a religious, semi-religious school. We had to go to church at all of the major celebrations. We had religious ceremony at the beginning of each day, etc. But people used to say, well, why don't you believe? Because it was normal. I mean, we're talking 50 years ago now. It was normal for everyone to be believers. And of course, I had to justify my disbelief, as it were. And so I had to read the texts and actually find out why I had rejected this story. And I soon found out at a very early age that actually I knew more about this subject than the people who were actually asking me and the people who were actually, lay preachers within the church, because they hadn't bothered to read the texts. And that was interesting. So I like sparring with these people about what their religion was really about. And I rapidly discovered that there were many holes in the story, big holes. In history, they call them lacuna, holes in the story or holes in the text. And that was interesting because the text didn't make any sense. So at that stage, I suppose my rationale was just making fun of these texts because they did not make sense. They did not accord with known history. And then later on, I started finding, well, possibly, you know, if we just turn this a little bit and have a look at it in a slightly different fashion, actually, we might be able to find some history in these texts. And that was fascinating because I saw immediately that no one had actually done this before, even though lots of people have been looking at the biblical texts. Everyone seemed to be so set in their ways and going by the classical explanation for these texts that nobody had seen the obvious. And so I started exploring these obvious parallels between biblical texts and real history. And I suppose the first of those that I sort of looked into was the Exodus out of Egypt, which was quite obviously something to do with the Santorini eruption. Now, that's not a topic I think that we're going to explore today, but there were so many parallels between, the plagues and the Santorini eruption in the Mediterranean. And then I found out that there was a real exodus out of Egypt. It's known as the Hyksos Exodus. In America, they tend to say Hyksos, but I think Hike is better. So Hyksos, the Hyksos shepherd kings or shepherd pharaohs of Egypt, they had an exodus out of Egypt. And it just so happens that it's exactly the same as the biblical exodus out of Egypt. And so that was interesting. And that's when I started actually sort of really writing about this and writing my first book, which came out in, I think, 96 or something, 96, 97. So yeah, 25 years ago for the first book. Quite a long time. So yeah, that was my interest, and it's been very fruitful, I have to say, because there were so many of these missing parts of the story, these holes in the story, which could be explained if you look at it laterally enough with a broad and open mind, so you're not stuck in the classical chronology or the classical names for these people, or the classical locations for these people. Suddenly, all of this history sort of drops out of the woodwork. So we have various methods of finding the real history. With the Exodus, it's merely looking into a different era. So instead of the 1220s BC, if you look at the 1500s BC, suddenly you can find the Exodus. With the United Monarchy, David and Solomon, it's not so much a different chronology, a different era, it's a different location. So the era is exact, it's the right era, but they're just looking in the wrong location for these people. And then when we come to the biblical story, we're back to chronology again. It's not an event that happened in the AD 30s. You will never find this story if you are wedded to the AD 20s and AD 30s. There is what I've called the chronological chasm, which was deliberate. This was organized by Rome, and we can get into that later maybe, where these events actually happened in the AD 60s. But they recast the story back into the AD 20s and AD 30 in order to separate this story from the Jewish revolt. And so again, the chronology is wrong. And if you just reset the chronology and look in the right era, suddenly you can find all of these people. And so that's been interesting because for the vast majority of these this research, nobody has ever looked at this before. So one or two people have been looking at the Exodus before. I've seen explanations that in previous books that said, oh, this might have something to do with the Santorini eruption. So some people have been looking at that in previous works. But nobody has been looking at the United Monarchy and replacing that back into the historical record. And nobody has ever mentioned Edessa. And this is the big finding I had in my New Testament work, which is, what do I call that one? It's the Gospel of King Jesus trilogy, I think it's called, which is now a trilogy in 4 parts. Trying to find the New Testament story and not even knowing anything about Edessa when I first started this investigation. So the first 2 books never mention Edessa because I didn't even know the place existed. Nobody does, because the place has been deleted from history deliberately by Josephus Flavius and other chroniclers of that era. And so you've really got to start searching around for this evidence. And finally, the evidence dropped out in the third book, as you mentioned there, Jesus, King of Edessa, that yes, you can link up the gospel story with this city-state, not just a city, it was a principality. They had their own king. This principality known as Edessa, which used to be in northern Syria, but nowadays it's in eastern Anatolia, just north of Aleppo, if you cross the border and go into Anatolia. It's next to Göbekli Tepe, which I found interesting. So anyone that's interested in history, if you know Göbekli Tepe, that is Edessa. It's right next door. And I didn't even know about it. The first time I've visited Edessa, I was more interested in this New Testament story. And so I was in Edessa. I was there for about a week. And the hotel manager, who was trying to double up as a guide, said, "Well, have you visited Göbekli Tepe yet?" And I said, "Well, no, I haven't, but it's not really on my itinerary. And how far away is it?" And he said, "Well, it's over there." Oh, okay. I didn't realize. So literally it was like, I don't know, 15 kilometers away or something, just down the road. So yeah, off we went and had a look at Göbekli Tepe. So that was fun. So I've been doing a bit of work on that as well. So that's basically what I've been up to over the last 40 years. As I say, it's been very fruitful. I've found pretty much most of the events and people within the biblical story. The odd thing about this is, although some people hate it, some people in the theological fraternity don't like it, of course, because I'm changing their story. But I'm not actually. The story remains the same. In historical terms, I don't do anything to do with the religious side of it, of course, or the spiritual side. But in historical terms, the story is the same. And so effectively what I've done is I've proven that the Old Testament and the New Testament are correct, substantially correct, something like 80–90% correct, but just not in the fashion that the theists really expect it. So they are expecting the standard story, which you all know. My revised story is the same, but a bit different. So you end up with these characters being real kings instead of pretend kings. So the patriarchs become pharaohs. The united monarchy, okay, they're kings, but now they become pharaohs. The Jesus character, he's known as a king. He is the king of the Jews. But then they disregard all of that and say, no, he was a pauper Prince of Peace. And it turns out that he was a real king, a lost king who has been lost from history. So it's the same story. It's just a slightly different interpretation. So I find that interesting that the story has been recorded fairly well, quite faithfully. It's just been misinterpreted because that's not the story that the Jewish rabbis or the Catholic priests wanted to sell to their followers. So yeah, a bit of a long introduction there, but that's the general gist.
No, that was incredible. It really was. And how you're able to play with the facts when you have them at hand and sift through the evidence, but also just play with what you have and teasing out the truth from these fragments, and also how you're able to, for instance, distinguish insults from the Talmud when people have taken them for either not making very much sense out of it or ascribing it to somebody completely different. I find that particularly incredible, and also the lengthy procedure that you go through to these original texts, and sifting through even the Chronicles of Geoffrey and Monmouth is just something to be in awe of, I think. But Caleb,
yeah, it's
sorry, go
pretty
ahead.
detailed because the history is long and it's complex. I mean, we're dealing with 3,500 years of history here. And so there's a lot of information to go through. It's come through different sources. It's been recorded, as you say, in a very haphazard fashion. Sometimes they've been deliberately covering things up, most definitely, and I can prove that there's been a deliberate sort of cover up on occasions. And so you then have to tease out the truth from those deliberate cover-ups, and that's tricky, and you can't do it unless you know the topic. So it's a bit of a it's a bit of a circle, really, that you cannot understand the history unless you understand the history. So you've got to be on the right level with this history before you can unravel what they've been trying to hide. For instance, if they're talking about Edessa, you can never unpick that history if you don't know anything about Edessa. And so for years and years and years, I didn't know anything about Edessa. And so all of those aspects of the story were completely unknown to me. You know, they just could not make sense because I did not have enough knowledge, enough background knowledge to make those things make sense. And then when I've discovered the history of Edessa, suddenly those things start to make sense. And some of the verses which were complete gobbledygook before, you know, they made no sense at all. Now suddenly they're speaking to you because you know what they're talking about. So yeah, it's a long process, and it's not something you can ever discover in a few years. It has to be a long, drawn-out process, and it was.
Caleb, do you have any questions at this point, or are you okay for me to fire one?
Okay. There we go. Okay, yeah.
Now we can hear.
my first question is an icebreaker question. It's partially specific, but it's also, as Ralph just said, covering 3,500 years. So it's just an icebreaker question, really. Is there a bloodline which is partially Parthian, partially Egyptian, which stretches all the way back to the Hyksos? Do they still exist as a cohesive group today? And can you trace them back even earlier than the Hyksos?
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is going back to the very origins of my research and the Exodus story. So if people are not familiar, there was a group of people who came down from Mesopotamia and took over Egypt. This was circa, well, normally they say about 1700 BC. I push it back a little bit further than that into about 1900 BC. And they took over northern Egypt, Lower Egypt, and they were known as the Hyksos, or the Hyksos, they say in America. And they were an immigrant population who became fully Egyptianized. But the country was thereafter slightly divided because they had different peoples in the north to different peoples in the south. And into that mix of populations and religions, you got the Santorini eruption, which was the biggest volcanic eruption in recorded history, I think, bigger than Krakatoa. I mean, this was enormous. And this was from my book, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, where you can actually connect up this story with the Exodus. So it was Santorini that caused the plagues. So the pillar of fire, the pillar of smoke, the 3 days of darkness, and the great ash fall. It's a pure, and of course the waters parting, when the waters parted and swallowed up the Egyptian army. That is a classic description of a maritime volcanic eruption. And in effect, that proves this is true, because what we have here is like 5 black swan events, events that you could never predict had they not happened and you observed them. And so to get a chronicler who has all of those events together in one story, events that you would never predict, and unless you had been there, you would never know are all linked to a volcano. You could never write that story. And the fact that that story got written it not just infers, it confirms that this was an eyewitness account of what had actually happened. Especially the things with the, like the tsunami, with the waters parting, the Egyptian army going across the beach, and then getting caught by the next tsunami wave coming in, as we've all seen in recent years with the Indonesian tsunami, where people did exactly the same. They walked out along the beach because the sea disappeared, and they thought, wow, this is fun. You can walk out along the beach. And then, of course, the sea rolls back in again and takes the Egyptian army. And then the ashfall, of course. So the ashfall is, what does he say? God says unto Moses, take you handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and cast it up into the sky, and it will become a small dust all across the lands of Egypt. It's a perfect description of the long-range fallout from a large volcano. And how would anyone know about that in this era if they had not witnessed it? But not only witnessed that, but all of the other 5 or 6 items that they describe within the plague story. So it must be an eyewitness event of the Santorini eruption, which means, so this is where we can start pulling out real history from this. And it gives us confidence that what these people were describing is actually correct. Because it means that the Exodus was much earlier. It has to be, because the Santorini eruption was 1600 BC. So the Exodus event that it's describing was much earlier than the classical era we have for it. And it's a true story. So we're no longer thinking of this as mythology. It seems like it's an eyewitness account of what actually happened. So it gives us confidence that what they're talking about in the Old Testament is probably based upon fact. And the result of this big eruption was the Exodus. And of course, we have an equivalence here as well, because we have the Hyksos, the people you were talking about here. They had an Exodus at this time, probably caused in part by this great volcanic eruption. So, the gods were angry. Somebody was to blame, and therefore it caused this civil war between Upper and Lower Egypt. So they are the Hyksos. Now, where did they come from? It's said that they came from Mesopotamia. And so the story is very similar to Abraham, who also came down from Haran in Mesopotamia. Where is Haran? Well, it's at Edessa, of course. We're going to talk about Edessa quite a lot. Haran is just 20 kilometers south of Edessa. It's in the same region. And they came down into Egypt, and they got kicked out in 1580 BC on a great exodus. We don't know a great deal about these people before they came down into Egypt. So there's not a lot of history there that we can go on. What happened to them afterwards? Well, I think that's very, very interesting. A, because we don't fully know, because this has not been explored properly. B, they might have been highly influential throughout the whole of the Mediterranean basin. Because I think they went on an exodus. Now, if you read Manetho, who's the Egyptian historian, 3rd century BC. He says they went to Jerusalem, the same as the biblical story says. I think that, yes, some of them did that, but I think some of them went off across the Mediterranean and spread their philosophy, their culture, their religion, and so on throughout the Mediterranean basin. And so we get quite a few instances where you can see Egyptian influence across the Mediterranean basin. And I was just going to do a screen share. Oh, there it is. So I was going to do a quick screen share here, if it'll come up. So start sharing, it says. So this is a just a quick comparison between the cultural artistic styles of ancient Egypt and Greece. And on the left is Ramesses II. Actually, it's probably not Ramesses II because he used to carve his name on every statue going. So this statue probably predates Ramesses II by a considerable amount of time. This is down from Luxor, and you can see Ramesses II on the left. And on the right, we see the early sculpture of ancient Greece. So we're going back to 6th or 7th century BC here in ancient Greece. And you can see the influence of Egypt upon early Greece. It's the same statue. Have a look at the left leg going forward. In Egypt, it was always the left leg forward. It's a bit like armies today. When an army starts off, it's by the left, quick march, and off they go. Well, the pharaohs did exactly the same. And so did this kouros. I think they call these kouros in Greece, these naked athletic guys. Arms down the side. On the left, you see carrying poles. There's still a great debate over what these pharaohs are doing, because all of the pharaohs have this. They're carrying things in their hands, and people have said, oh, they're carrying scrolls. No, that's not how you carry a scroll. I've never carried a scroll in that fashion. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. This was a traditional thing within Egypt. They all had arks, and within the arks, and these arks are exactly as you imagine it. They look exactly the same as the Ark of the Covenant. Within these arks, they had the images of the gods in these little boxes. And of course, the box was carried on 2 poles. And that's what the Pharaoh is doing. He's carrying the poles, the carrying poles, for the ark, which contains the image of the god. And they used to take these images of the god between one temple and another temple, and in a big ceremony. And that's exactly what they're doing here. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant.
What did they call these images? Sorry.
Yeah.
What did they call these images?
Well, I mean, it depends which god they were venerating. So you've got, it could be any of the Egyptian gods. It could be Thoth. It could be Ra. It could be.
I just meant, what did they call the images themselves? Is it called teraphim? Those images?
No, that would be a Judaic equivalent in Egypt.
Okay.
I don't know the generic name for a god image in Egypt.
No problem. I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So if you look at the Ark of Tutankhamun, which is in the Cairo Museum, it's exactly the same as is described in the Old Testament. It's exactly the same. So these were quite common. But going back to these statues, you can see the headdress of the Egyptian, and they've replaced the headdress in the Greek version with his hairstyle is now the headdress. So it's just pointing out the similarities we get between Greek and Egyptian culture. How did that happen? I think it's because there was, I'm just going to unshare that if I can find the button. There we go. I think, and this is a little bit speculative at present because there's still much work to be done on this, but I've been looking at this on and off for several years, and there seems to be evidence that these exoduses were not simply land exoduses. They went out across the Mediterranean, and they seeded the high cultures around the Mediterranean islands. Obviously, there was a very early high civilization on Crete and Santorini before this happened, but afterwards we find all of these.
Spartans were descendants of the Hyksos as well.
Sorry, which ones?
The Spartans?
Yeah. The Book of Maccabees says that the Spartans were descendants of the Hyksos. Well, what it says is that the Israelites and the Spartans were cousins, cultural cousins. So yes, again, they're saying that Egypt seeded a number of civilizations across the Mediterranean basin. And while you're just talking about that, the links between the Hyksos and the Israelites are very strong. Not only was their exodus pretty much the same, but Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, says that the Hyksos were our forefathers. So he's deliberately connecting the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt with the early Israelites. And remember, they were both called shepherds. One of the pharaohs of the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt was called Jacob, exactly the same as we find in the Old Testament, Jacob. There are so many links between them, and yet you will not find that if you look into reference books or even if you look on Wiki. People will not allow that information, that there are strong links between the Hyksos and the Israelites, that they were probably the same people. And that's interesting because that changes the story somewhat, and that's what some of my early books are about. So yeah, and just as an illustration of the blinkered thinking that we get, I found this a few months back when I was researching this again for another podcast. And this is about the similarities between the Hyksos and the Israelites. And this is from BTAC, who's one of the top archaeologists in this field. He's worked in Egypt for like 40 years, excavating the cities in the north of Egypt in the Nile Delta. And he's done a lot of the work on the Hyksos because that's where they came from. They came from that region. And he says the population of the Hyksos experienced the glory of controlling the delta, the Nile Delta, and a part of the Nile Valley for over 100 years. Well, I would say it was more like 200 years, but there we go. However, this is in no way in keeping with the tradition of the Israelites and their experience of oppression in Egypt. That is why an association of the Hyksos and their people with the Proto-Israelites should be dismissed. You think, hold on a minute there, BTAC. What he's saying is the Israelites can't be the Hyksos because they're not the Hyksos. He's presupposed the fact that they're not the Hyksos and using that as a proof that they're not the Hyksos.
Methinks someone's protesting too much.
I think so, yes, because if you accept that the Hyksos were the Israelites, then of course the Israelites can be the Hyksos. It stands to fact. And the only difference between the two, really, which BTAC doesn't mention, is the 350 years chronological chasm, you might say, between the classical era for the for the Exodus, and the actual era, which was in 1580 BC when it was the Hyksos Exodus. So that's the sort of logical deduction you have to make when looking at this material. You can't just accept what academia is telling you, because I'm not sure if you could say they have an agenda, but they certainly have a structure which they've teased out of these histories over, many decades of very dedicated work looking at these things, and they've formed this structure, this chronological and cultural structure, which tells their story of history. And it's very difficult to break that. And so when someone comes along and says, "Oh, actually, you're wrong. The Exodus happened 350 years before that time," and suddenly they're going to resist it, aren't they? And they do. They resist it because it's not within their mode of thinking, you might say. And they'll say other things like the Hyksos Exodus can't be the Israelite Exodus because there is no evidence for Jericho being destroyed by the Israelites, because Jericho had been abandoned for hundreds of years before the Exodus. Again, a circular sort of reasoning, because in reality, it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho, because Jericho was destroyed in about the 1580s BC by the Hyksos. And so again, we can amalgamate these two events and say, actually, the Hyksos and the Israelites are the same people. So that was one of the first things I started looking at. So I'm not sure if I've answered all of your question there. Have I left anything out?
I was trying to stretch the answer from all the way from the very, very beginning all the way up to now. That's okay. You laid a good foundation.
Yeah. Well, we start running out of history, of course. But if you allow the connection that I've made between the Hyksos and the Israelites, then of course we do know what happened to the Hyksos. They're all around us now. They're known as the Jews. These are the descendants of the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt. And okay, they've been kicked out of various places en route, so they've had many exoduses. They had a second exodus in Egypt. They had the Babylonian exile. They were kicked out of Israel by the Romans in AD 70. They've been knocked around Europe for a couple of thousand years, but they're still with us. And quite possibly, if this history is correct, as I've teased it out of the records we have, the Israelites, the Jews, are the Hyksos peoples of Egypt. They're still here. They're still living in that region. They're living in Israel at this very, very moment. And still following a religion. Oh, no, I can't say that. I was going to say they're still following a religion that's similar to what they had all that time ago. But the religion they had when they were in Egypt was substantially Egyptian, of course. These were a fully Egyptianized people. When they were in the Delta, they tended to venerate Seth more than any of the other Egyptian gods, who can be identified with Shaddai. I don't know if you know, but the Jewish God has many names, and they are different aspects of the same God. So the Jewish God is called Elohim, Allah, Yahweh, of course, Shaddai, and Adon. Those are the names of God within the Old Testament. And they are different aspects of the original belief system in Egypt. But what's happened is they adopted monotheism, the monotheism of Pharaoh Akhenaten, and all of those gods had to be jumbled together into one. And of course, that's never going to work. You're always going to get some unsightly bulges because they don't all fit together. And that's why we get, such a strange mix of stories about these gods. So El, Elohim, and Allah are the sun god, basically. El is the sun god. Yah is the Egyptian moon god. Yah means the moon in Egyptian. So Yahweh is the moon god. Shaddai is the god of storms and tempests and all of that sort of business. He is Seth. He is the Egyptian Seth. And then Ardon is the Egyptian Ardon or Aten, the god of Akhenaten. They are still venerating the god of Akhenaten. He has the same name. He is the Ardon, the Aten. And he was a monotheistic god, the god of Akhenaten, of course. And that, again, is part of the Old Testament story still. So, yes, all of these gods got jumbled into one because of their monotheism. But they're still present. If you look within the Old Testament, they're still there.
So we're jumping forward now, quite a bit forward. And my next question is about the Iron Curtain. You have spoken about an iron curtain, which separated the Holy Roman Empire from the Near East, which was eventually breached during the Crusades. What was the purpose of this Iron Curtain, and how many new cults and sects appeared to pop up in Europe after that date as a result of that Iron Curtain being breached?
Yeah. Okay. So we are. We're jumping on a few centuries here to the post-revolt era. So Christianity got established. Now, Christianity is connected to Egypt. We'll go through this later. It's a subset of Judaism. So we had Orthodox Judaism, and then within first century Judea, we had the Nazarene Judaism of Jesus and James. We'll run through this later, but theirs was a substantially different type of Judaism. I call it Egypto-Judaism, but it was still recognizably Judaism, following every jot and tittle of Judaic law. And then along came Saul, St. Paul, and he created his own brand of Rome-friendly Judaism. I call it simple Judaism. A completely different, this was Judaism for Gentiles. Saul became the apostle to the Gentiles. And so he set up his own church. And although he was ridiculed to start with, his church became more powerful than the Nazarene church of Jesus and James. And he won the battle, as it were. He became more influential. And so that was the religion that went forward and became Christianity. Which is odd, because it means anyone who is, because these two churches became enemies of each other. They were at each other's throats. Saul was actually imprisoning these Nazarene Jews. And so anyone who's following the church, the Catholic Church, is actually following the church of the enemy of Jesus. Because Jesus was not a Christian. He was a Nazarene Jew. Nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity is the church of Saul, St. Paul. So that's a very rough and quick description of how Christianity came about. So then we had Christianity. This was, circa AD 70 is when it really started getting going. And then we got up to the adoption by Constantine, of course. Then it became a sort of state religion. And then we had the Council of Nicaea. So we had a multitude of churches, of Christian churches, all with different ideas about Jesus, about God, about the gospel story. And they wanted to make it Catholic, I think is the term that that they would use. They wanted to standardize it. And so they had the Council of Nicaea, 4th century, to try and thrash out a standard church. And then they had the Council of Chalcedon to thrash out again a standard church. But what it actually did is it divided the church between East and West. So we had the Western Church based in Rome, with the popes, of course. Now the popes were getting established. Then we had the Greek Orthodox Church, which again didn't agree with all of these debates they had had at Chalcedon. And then in the East, in Syria and going into Iraq, we had the Syriac Church, which was different again. So we ended up with 3 Christian churches, all with a different interpretation of what Christianity should be about. And so that was 5th century for the Council of Chalcedon. And then we came along to and that was unfortunate in a way. That was the reason that Islam was allowed to expand. Then we come across to the formation of Islam, 7th century. And Islam expanded very, very rapidly, mainly because there were divisions amongst the Christian churches. And so when Islam started growing as a military force, remember, it was growing within Christianity. So people don't seem to realize sometimes that all of these locations in the Middle East and Near East and North Africa, they were all Christian. So all of North Africa was Christian. All of modern Anatolia, that was all Christian. All of the Near East was Christian. Most of Iraq and Iran and all of those places were Christian and Jewish. There was a huge, great Jewish influence in Saudi Arabia, modern Saudi Arabia, the Arabias, and in Iraq. Iraq was run by the Jews up until 1947. So there was a lot of those influences in that part of the region. And then into this came Islam with its very belligerent, warlike philosophy based on war, because the whole of Islam was created during a war with the Jews. Remember, as I said again, the Arabias were Jewish at that time, substantially. And Muhammad got himself involved with a battle with the Jews of Medina. And one of the tribes in Medina were exiled and went up to Jordan. So they were actually pushed out of their homeland and disappeared. The other tribe, which is the Banu Qurayza tribe in Medina, he accused them of treachery in the war that he was having with Mecca. And so he lined up the 800 men of the Banu Qurayza tribe and beheaded them all. And apparently this took them 2 days to behead. There were so many that it took them 2 days to behead them all. That was the foundation of the Quran and Islam. And that's why it's so anti-Judaism to this very day. And they started spreading out of the Arabias, coming up against the Byzantine Empire. Remember, the Byzantine Empire at that time was Christian. It was Greek Orthodox, I suppose you could say. And in the East, it was slightly Syriac, I suppose. And they started getting defeated. And of course, because there was this split between East and West in Christianity, the Western Christians did not come to the assistance of their Eastern cousins, because they thought, oh, well, they're getting defeated. The Muslims are doing our work for us, defeating these heretics over in the East who didn't have the right understanding of Jesus. And so they let them continue. And they did. And so Islam and the Islamic armies pushed across the whole of that region in about 50 years or something. took over the whole of North Africa, all of the Near East, all of Anatolia, pretty much. Not quite all of Anatolia. That sort of hung out for quite a long time. And the Iron Curtain of Islam, as I say, came down between Western Christianity and what was now Islamic lands. And it was a tragic destruction. If you go around these Byzantine cities, big Roman cities, they were utterly destroyed in the most barbaric of manners. If you go to places like Spitla, which is out in Tunisia, it's a big Roman town in Tunisia. The people of the people of Spitla tore down their own city in order to use that material to build a castle in the center of their city, to protect themselves against the invading armies of Islam as they came across the region. So they destroyed their entire city in order to make a castle. They did the same in Baalbek in Lebanon. They destroyed the temple of Baalbek in order to make it into a castle, in order to protect themselves against the invading armies. Because the Byzantine Empire lived pretty much in peace, and so a lot of these cities had no city wall. They had no need for it. Rome was so strong, had been so strong for, nigh on 1,000 years. Why would you need a city wall? So they were defenseless. Go to Western Anatolia. If you go to Didyma, the big Greek temple of Didyma, they tore it down to make it into a castle, to protect themselves against the invading Muslim armies. That's how tragic this was. If you go to Syria, around Aleppo, we've got the dead cities of Aleppo, where you've got 800 settlements, towns, cities, farmsteads, all the rest of it, 800 settlements that are still there today, abandoned by their populations. They just left. And you can still go into the cities now, well, cities, towns. You can walk down the main street, you can go into the shops, you can go into their cathedrals, because they're still there, just lying there, abandoned, in the plains of Syria. Abandoned because of the advancing Muslim armies. So that was how tragic this invasion was for Christianity. It destroyed Eastern Christianity almost completely, took it out, and formed this great barrier between
both the Greek and the Syriac.
Pretty much, because the Greek held on for a while. Remember, Constantinople didn't fall until 1453. So it held out for another 600 years. But Constantinople by that time was just a mere rump of itself. Most of its lands, and therefore most of its industry and most of its economic production had already been taken over by that time. And so it was only a matter of time until Constantinople would fall. So you had this iron curtain between Western Christianity and Islam. So, I mean, this was the reason for the Crusades, was to get these lands back for the name of Christianity that had been taken away. But the interesting thing from my research is that because these Eastern lands were behind the Iron Curtain of Islam, the Western Christian Church had no control over them. And that's interesting because they held different information, different histories. They held the Syriac version of history, not the Western approved Christian version of history. And so we get two versions, very different versions of this gospel type story. And it's different. What we learn from this, the main thing we learn from this, is that Western Christian history, Christian influenced history, has deleted Edessa. from history. That's why nobody knows anything about it. So you can look through the accounts of Josephus Flavius, and you can do a word search for Edessa or the Edessan kings, you know, Abgarus or Manu, and it'll just say nothing found. Deleted from his works. And yet we know that Josephus knew all about Edessa because, well, for many reasons, but the best of those reasons is the battle between the king of Petra, who was known as Aretas, the king of Petra, and Antipas, who was the tetrarch or king of Judea. So for Christians who understand the New Testament story, this was the John the Baptist story. So that's a real story because it's in real history. We know that this happened, so this is not just a gospel story. So the basis for this story is that Herod Antipas was married to the daughter of King Aretas, but he sent her back home again. He divorced her and sent her back home because he wanted to marry Herodias instead, and who was the wife of King, one of the other tetrarchs. And so we can date this quite accurately to about AD 33. And it was John the Baptist who came along and said, this marriage is illegal. You're not allowed to do this because she is the wife of someone else. And you're not allowed to marry this woman. And she was also, I think she was a cousin as well. So she was very closely related. And for that, John the Baptist got his head cut off, of course. And this story is related by Josephus Flavius. So we don't have just the Gospels to rely on. We can use Josephus Flavius. And he says, because of these events, King Aretas sent an army up to Judea to go and punish Antipas because his daughter had been spurned. That's why he was upset, because his daughter had been sent home. So he does. And Josephus says that the army of King Aretas was joined by some fugitives from Syria and defeated Herod Antipas. And you think, hold on a minute. Josephus knows everything that's going on. He knows all of the people, all of the events, all of these royal families. Why is he saying some fugitives from Syria? And again, if you didn't have a broad understanding of these texts, you might just read that and gloss over it. It might not mean anything to you. And it wouldn't mean anything to you unless you had read the Syriac historians who had come from behind the Iron Curtain of Islam and who had a different version of these events. And so if you read Moses of Corine, he gives exactly the same story, except that he says that the army of King Aretas of Petra was joined by the Edessan army of King Abgarus of Edessa in order to defeat Antipas. Okay, now we get the full story. And what we understand from that is, A, Josephus is being economical with the truth. He's deliberately covering it up. And B, I suppose that Josephus has covered up the Edessan element because he tells the rest of the story, but he doesn't mention Edessa because Edessa had been made taboo by the Romans. You weren't allowed to discuss them. You weren't allowed to mention them. And so we know now that Josephus has deleted the Edessans from this story. So yeah, that's one interesting piece of the other thing about this, of course, is from this we can get an idea that Edessa is important in this story. Because why were they down there in Judea? Why were the Edessans in Judea? I mean, they came from northern Syria. Why were they upset with the king of Judea, the tetrarch of Judea? King Aretas of Petra, we know why he was upset, because his daughter had been sent back home again. His daughter had been spurned, so he was upset. But why were the Edessans down there? It's quite a long way to go from northern Syria all the way down to Judea. Why were they down there? The only other significant event that happened at this very time with this battle was the beheading of John the Baptist. It rather suggests that John the Baptist was linked somehow to the Edessan royal family. And if John the Baptist was linked, then Jesus must be linked as well, because they were cousins, of course. And so immediately we are pushing Edessa into the center stage of this gospel story. And then, of course, we come to the Crusades, just to finish this little extract about the Iron Curtain. The whole reason for the Crusades was that these were Christian lands, all of Judea, all of Syria, all of the Near East and the Middle East. These were Christian lands that had been taken over by Islam in the 7th century. And the Crusades set off to restore Christianity to those lands. So off they go, First Crusade, 1096, and their army under Count Baldwin of Boulogne goes out across Anatolia, and they get to Antioch, which is on the sort of northeast corner of the Mediterranean, and they don't go to Jerusalem, which is odd. So where did the First Crusade go to? Well, the first city that they liberated from Muslim control was Edessa. So the Crusades went to Edessa. They didn't go to Jerusalem. And again, you've got to ask yourself, why? What did they know about Edessa? Because, I mean, nobody now in the modern era knows anything about it. What did they know about Edessa that we don't know now? What did they find in Edessa that was so interesting? What did they find in Edessa that only 10 years later, the Knights Templar was set up as a society for keeping religious secrets?
It also seems to suggest that some of the organizers of the crusade harbored some sort of, I don't know, anti-Council of Nicaea, anti-Council of, what was the second one that you had mentioned?
Chalcedon, yeah.
Chalcedon, because those councils wanted nothing to do with anything of Edessa, but and they blocked it out, and then the Iron Curtain happened. But somehow the Crusades ended up with people who were interested in that.
Yeah, it sort of suggests that Count Baldwin of Boulogne must have known something about this history. Otherwise, he wouldn't have known anything about Edessa or why it was important in this crusade, because the crusade was to, save these regions from Islam and to re-establish the Christian church in Jerusalem. The church of, effectively, it wasn't, but there we go, the Church of Jesus and James. But they went to Edessa first. They must have known that the biblical story was connected with Edessa. And we don't know why. We don't know what they knew, or if they were connected genetically, perhaps, if they were descended from this biblical royal family. We don't know, and we don't know what they found there either. But what we do know is whatever it was, the Knights Templar became the richest organization in the whole of the Western world, as it were, in the whole of Christendom. The Knights Templar must have held something of extreme import that people would join them so readily, give all of their wealth to the church because they ran a sort of communist type system. Well, in fact, they ran exactly the same system as the Church of Jesus and James. The Church of Jesus and James used to live out of the common purse. If you joined their church, you had to give all of your wealth to the church. You remember the verses about Ananias, who tried to join the church, and he was told that he would have to give all of his wealth to the church when he joined, and he didn't. He kept back some property and didn't give it all to the church, and so Saint Peter killed them both, Ananias and Sapphira. That's how they ran these organizations. You had to give your whole life and all of your wealth and everything to the church. And the Knights Templar did exactly the same. That's why they were known as the Poor Knights of Christ, because they were effectively a sort of communist type organization where you, as a member of the Knights Templar, didn't own anything. You just lived, and everything you needed would be given to you by the organization, same as if you lived on a kibbutz. But although they called themselves the Poor Knights of Christ, that doesn't mean that the Knights Templar were poor. The organization itself was the richest organization in the whole of Christendom. So, they became very powerful. How did they become powerful? I think they held some secrets. And if they knew and understood the genealogy of Jesus had something to do with Edessa, and they had found some ancient chronicles, texts, or genealogies within Edessa which sort of proved that, that would be very powerful. It would be an organization that could undermine and can control the Catholic Church because it had the alternative historical truth behind the gospel story.
They could also maybe use the information as blackmail against the church.
Absolutely. Yes.
The last little bit of that question was just the idea that after the Crusades and this Iron Curtain was breached, that allowed a flow of information which had been impossible before. So not only did the Knights Templars bring secrets back to the West that they found in the Near East, but it seems like when and I've picked up on this a bit from looking at the witch hunts, because not only was it witches, it was basically any heretics, and you find these groups that the church was after, that were heretical groups, the Luciferians, Gnostics, and different people. There were a lot of different groups that were popping up, and I just noticed that this was occurring a lot more after the Crusades than it was before, because the church was after witches and heretics before the Crusades started, but after the Crusades it just seems to explode even more, and I suspect that it's because of a flow from the Near East of different ideas and people that were coming in. Have you seen evidence for that at all?
Loads. The classic one is Arthurian legend. And I don't know if you want to attack that as a separate topic later, because it's another fairly large topic. But Arthurian legend came out of the Crusades. This is the conundrum we have with Arthurian legend. Everyone thinks they know the story because they've been to the cinema, they've seen the classical interpretation. That's not what happened at all. There is no evidence for the King Arthur story before the Crusades. So the first story, because none of the original chroniclers mention King Arthur, Gildas, Bede, Nennius, all of these early chroniclers don't mention the Arthurian story at all. And people would get upset with me and say, yes, they do. Yes, they do. And my simple answer is, go and give me a quote then. Quote me from Gildas about King Arthur. Quote me from Bede about King Arthur. And of course they can't. They think that they know this history because they've picked up on this history from random sources from, Hollywood and badly researched Arthurian books. But the truth of the matter is the first Arthurian story was by Monmouth and Oxford, and that didn't come out until 1135 AD, which was like 30 years after the Crusades and about, I think about 10 years after the Knights Templar were founded. I forget when they were founded now. But it was just after the Knights Templar were founded. Suddenly we get Arthurian legend. And so that story came out of the Crusades. And again, Arthurian purists will jump up and down and say I'm wrong. But the primary hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. So we're not talking about King Arthur at all. Most of this story is about first century Judea. It's about Joseph of Arimathea. That's a big part of the story. And so again, this story comes out of the Near East. And so that's my complete reanalysis of Arthurian legend, which is in my book, The Grail Cipher. And it has nothing to do with Wales. It has nothing to do with Britain. It's a European story because it's a Knights Templar story. I mean, for instance, here's a for instance, just for viewers looking in. Where might you find the earliest sculptures and mosaics of King Arthur? Now, these are very early. These are 12th century, so they're going back a long, long way. 12th century statues or sculptures and mosaics of King Arthur. Where would they be? Wales,
Knights
England,
Templar churches,
Cornwall. Actually, they're in Italy. So the earliest imagery we get of the Arthurian story, and it's complete Arthurian story. It's Guinevere locked in the tower, with Mordred. Is it Mordred? Yeah, I think it's Mordred. Locked in the tower and being besieged by King Arthur and his knights and Lancelot and all the rest of it. Oh, it's a nice little frieze, but it's on the cathedral at Modena in northern Italy. Or there's one down on the heel of Italy as well. The same frieze is down there, and they're very early. So the knights are Norman knights, of course, because that's the Norman era. So that's where this story comes from. It's nothing to do with the traditional story that we have been taught through badly made films and badly made textbooks. It's a European story because the Knights Templar were a European organization. They were mainly based in France. They had big contingents in Italy and Germany, of course. That's why Wolfram von Eschenbach is the other big author of Arthurian legend. He was a Knights Templar. The only place we don't get Arthurian legends from, because we get Arthurian books from Greece, we get them from Holland, we get them from France, we get them from Italy. We get them from all over the place. The only place we don't get any manuscripts of Arthurian legend from is Britain, who didn't produce any until Thomas Mallory, who was very late. Even Monmouth and Oxford, although the guys were based in England as it's Wales and England, because Monmouth is more in Wales, I suppose. Although they were based there, The story came out of Normandy and out of Brittany. That's what they say, that they went to Brittany to pick up this text from Brittany. So it wasn't a Welsh story at all.
Well,
So,
the Norman invasion of England didn't happen very long previous.
Yeah.
1066, and it wasn't long
1066.
after that they went and did the Crusades.
Yep.
That
Yep.
maybe suggests they found the information up in Britain.
It's all happening at the same time, mostly organized by Normans. It was the Normans who kicked the Muslims out of Italy. King Roger I of Sicily, who liberated Sicily from Muslim control, and then the heel of Italy from Muslim control in about 1060, so just before the First Crusades. And King Roger of Italy was a Norman. He wasn't Italian at all. And so he was a redhead. They're all gingers, of course. So King Roger I would have been a ginger, the same as the Normans of Normandy and Britain were all ginger-haired as well. So yeah, that's another favorite topic of mine as well, following the ginger monarchy. We still have one. He's stuck in America at present, and I think you can keep him. We don't want him.
So my next question is, when did this bloodline begin practicing castration?
Oh, no, there's an interesting little story. Actually, it's a big, long story, this one. Yes, this is an example of how things can be covered up within the gospel story. And so I'm sure a lot of listeners and viewers have been brought up as Christians, and they sort of know the gospel story and they know what's going on. But they don't, because they've not been told the truth. And unless you actually read the texts yourself, you will know nothing about this. This is what I was doing when I was younger. I'm being challenged about Christianity, so deciding to actually read the text myself, and then looking at these texts thinking, wow, I didn't know anything about that. And neither do the priests I'm talking to as well, these lay preachers that I'm talking to when you go to Sunday school. They didn't know anything about it either. Anyway, one of the things we find in this region, in this era, in the 1st century, is the cult of the eunuch, the castrato. And it has something to do with the gospel story, as we'll see in a minute. And this, I suppose, comes back to Attis and Cybele. If you read about it, it's Attis and Cybele. Most people call her Cybele, but in Greek it was a hard K, so she's called Cybele. And Cybele was the archetypal sort of mother goddess, really, a really ancient goddess from Greece. Why did I forget where Greece was for a minute? Anyway, so she's a Greek goddess, and her consort was Attis, who was a youthful young lad who happened to be a eunuch. He was castrated, and the cult that he established was known as the Galli, or the Galileans. And this has a knock-on effect to Arthurian legend as well, without getting too distracted from the main topic here. Because in Arthurian legend, when it refers to Wales, it's calling them the Gallies, because Wales apparently was called Galles before it became Wales or Wales. But Galles, of course, refers to the eunuch priests of Cybele or Cybele and their famous black meteoric stone. And so when Arthurian legend is talking about Galles, it's probably talking about eunuchs, because the central thing about Arthurian legend is the story of the wounded king. And the wounded king was wounded between the thighs. So I think we all know what happened there. And so when it's talking about Wales, it's not talking about Wales at all. It's talking about Galilee. It's talking about Judea, Galilee, where the Galileans were. Because we start getting tied up with, where should we take this first? Well, let's tie it into the gospel story first so that people know that we're talking about the right era and the right location. So this became closely connected with the gospel story. Because remember, these people, the eunuchs, were known as Galileans, the Galli or Galileans, and both Jesus and Peter were both known as Galileans. Now, was that because they came from Galilee?
I just want to clarify. We're not starting in the middle of the story, or we did the Hyksos practice castration? Because that would be earlier.
Yes. There is an earlier element to this because, let's tie it into gospel story first of all, and then we'll take it back because we've got to know that it's linked into the Israelite Judaic story first of all. So this is connected to the Gospels because Jesus asked for his disciples to castrate themselves. And this is the area where people won't know about this because it's not preached in church, and so you probably won't have heard about it. But anyway, this comes from Matthew 19:11. And Jesus said to his disciples, he said, all men cannot receive this saying, except to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs who were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs by men. But there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So Jesus is saying to his disciples, if you can castrate yourself, then you should. Because the priests of the Galileans, the Galilee priests of Kibel, were castrated, following on from Attis, because Attis was castrated. And so, shocking as that may be, Jesus and his disciples, many of them, would have been castrated. And this ties in with the Nazarene, the Nazarene, because remember that Jesus was a Nazarene. Jesus and Saul were both Nazarene. And remember, when it mentions Saul, St. Paul, he is said to be of the sect of the Nazarene. This was a Jewish sect known as the Nazarene. But the Nazarene were linked, I suppose you could say, to Attis, because we have this from Hippolytus in his Heresies 5.2. He's talking about the Nazarene. Obviously, he's critical. That's why he's talking about them. And he says that the Nazarenes say there is a hermaphrodite man who is known as the primeval Adam. And they say that Attis has been emasculated. This is Attis and Kibel. The Attis has passed over from the earthly parts to the netherworld to the everlasting substance above, where he says there is neither male nor female, but a new creature, a new man, which is a hermaphrodite, the primeval Adam.
Wow.
So the primeval Adam was, they're saying a hermaphrodite here, but I'm thinking more of a androgynous myself, someone with not with both sex organs, but no sex organs at all, a sexless being, a bit like what we're seeing in modern culture now, I think. I don't know. Everyone seems to want to be castrating themselves nowadays. Perhaps they're all following the words of Jesus or something. I don't know.
This was going to be my question. It was going to be, why would you do this? It's cutting off your genetic line, but there has to be something in the psychology, right? There has to be, like, you're cutting off your male parts. So is this, so you think that you're becoming the supreme being by cutting off that male part of you and becoming more balanced with the female and masculine that way? Or are you simply cutting off your genitalia to be more like the goddess that you're worshipping? And it's always, it's a question that just keeps ringing back in my mind.
Well, the first point is that you didn't have to necessarily do this as a youngster. And so really this was for the high priesthood. It wasn't for the lay person. And so you might only castrate yourself when you got to become high priest, so in later life. So you could have a dozen children, and then when you get to, I don't know what age you might be, let's call it 40 or whatever years old, then you can go through the ceremony and castrate yourself and become a high priest.
Ah, right.
So you can actually pass on your seed before you become a high priest. So yeah, why would you want to do it? Well, yes, I suppose as it's saying here, you're following in the footsteps of the primeval Adam, the original progenitor of mankind. And what's it talking about? Because we don't really know who the primeval Adam is. A demiurge, I suppose. He's a creator god. He's not the high god. He's more of a demigod and a demiurge. A demiurge is an artisan god, a creator god, which a lot of people despised because they weren't the higher material. He was,
which relating to the beliefs of Akhenaton, right?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking, because if this is something to do with the Israelites and Akhenaten, I'm going to do a quick share screen here. The thing is with Akhenaten is you might consider him to be a primeval Adam. I mean, for instance, in my books, before I do the share screen, I've already identified Akhenaten as being something to do with the Genesis story, because the Genesis story has links with the Amarna dynasty. The Amarna dynasty is influential. That's why one of the god names of the Israelites is the Arden or the Aten. It's because they knew all about Akhenaten. That's why Psalms 104 in the book of Psalms is the hymn to the Aten. So of course they knew about Akhenaten. They actually included one of his famous hymns within the biblical story. And so, yeah, he's connected. We'll go through how he's connected more later. But if they were looking back to an original progenitor patriarch, not necessarily a god, but they might think of him as a god, then Akhenaten himself, and that should be coming up now, you should have an image of Akhenaten.
That's right, yeah.
And he is a sexless being. He is androgynous.
He has the wide childbearing hips of the mother goddess.
He has a slight bust. He has no genitalia, and he has his strange almond-shaped face and eyes and so on. And he's been deliberately portrayed in this fashion because he didn't really look like this. I mean, he didn't have a disease. Lots of people keep trying to say that he had some sort of disease. No, this is a deliberate portrayal by Akhenaten, sanctioned by Akhenaten himself, because his sculptors would not do this if they had not been given permission by the king himself to do this, to portray himself in this fashion as the primeval Adam. So this is the first imagery we get of what I consider to be the primeval Adam, the very demigod that the Nazarene were following, because Akhenaten is something to do with the original Israelite story, as we will go through later. He's connected with the Exodus, and we'll talk about that later. Manetho confirms this. So this is what they were looking back to, I think. This was the androgynous primeval Adam that they were venerating.
And it's not just that. Sorry, it's not just that either. I've seen wall murals, wall carvings with the same thing, a distended belly, almost like he's pregnant, with breasts. And there's many more, not just this photo here, but there's much more evidence of this. Sorry, go on.
Oh, yes.
And it's interesting, the Novocastrian and I did a series on Loki, and one of the things with Loki is that he actually pregnant because he changed into a female horse and got pregnant by a male horse as part of a ruse to delay a building project. But I've been wondering in the back of my mind if there's a connection between Loki and Akhenaton. I don't know if there is or not, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I don't know enough about that history to make a connection, so it'd be nice if someone who knows the Icelandic and Scandinavian sagas in more detail, because these traditions did go into that direction. I go through this with my book, Scota, the Egyptian Queen of the Scots, where there was an exodus out of Egypt that went to Ireland and Scotland. And that comes from Scottish history, a very ancient Scottish history, 14th century, and a very early Irish history, 6th century, the Lebor Gabala and Scotti Chronicon, which say that these people, the next generation on from these people, including a daughter of Akhenaten, went to Ireland and Scotland. So there is an element of this story which heads out in that direction. But I was just bringing up this picture here because
that would have allowed the possibility for mythologies from the north to be transmitted back to the east and vice versa.
Yep. There would be a lot of synergy between these stories because they were linked because of the cultural exodus from one place to another, from Egypt up to northwestern Europe. So this is just another picture showing Akhenaten as the primeval Adam, naked, of course. This is Nefertiti, naked. Now imagine the scandal this would cause if you had, for instance, the Queen of England, who is effectively Kate, I suppose, at present, Kate and William, and she goes on a walkabout in London and she's naked, just walking around London, wearing a hat. I mean, she has to wear her hat, so she's got the but apart from that, just strolling around, you know, saying hello to all of the population. Hello, I'm naked. This was the sort of Adam and Eve philosophy of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. You remember Adam and Eve were naked in the Garden of Eden? Well, these two were naked in the Garden of the Aten. And of course, the Aten is spelt with the reed glyph, and the reed glyph is pronounced as an E more than an A. So they were naked in the Garden of Eden. Same story. And this, I think this one on the right, is that porphyry, that stone? I can't remember. This one on the right is, I think, a daughter of Nefertiti. And again, you can see that she is portrayed as being pretty much naked, apart from a sort of diaphanous robe that she's got, which doesn't cover up anything, basically. So yes, this is the sort of hippie philosophy of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And so, yes, they could be equated with the primeval Adam. So I'll just knock that on the head and come out of sharing. So yeah, it's all interesting stuff, and it sort of implies that a lot of this history is interconnected. We tend to think of Egypt as being entirely separate, from world history because, well, it was in Egypt. But if this was something to do with the Israelite story, and if the Scota Exodus is also correct, and my idea of the Hyksos being pushed out across the Mediterranean is correct, then these people have spread far and wide across the Mediterranean basin. Because as the Israelites, they were pushed out, as we've said before, on 3 or 4 occasions from various places, and ended up all over Europe, spreading their slightly changed culture, because this, modern Jews don't celebrate God in the same fashion that Akhenaten would have done. But a lot of the material and culture is very similar and has preserved itself through the millennia and is now spread out around Europe, because that culture spread itself into Christianity, and Christianity has spread itself across Europe and across the world. So, yeah, it's all interconnected.
So my next question is, does the bloodline have its own pantheon of gods? And I'm sort of thinking, like, what is, like, over the spans of time, all the way back to the Hyksos, the Atnas, and you have the Nazarenes, and then the groups, the Knights Templar. Okay, is there a consistency over time? Do they retain the same pantheon of gods? What is their core ideology? Do they tend to disguise the true nature of their beliefs to the outside world?
Yes, I think is the short answer. But the long answer is we don't know, because we don't have enough information as to how much of this history has survived. The problem is all of the many exoduses and pogroms and persecutions and so on has diluted the information that they used to have. Things like, the Knights Templar being destroyed in Friday the 13th of October, 1307. Which is why Friday the 13th is still unlucky for some, because that's the day that the Knights Templar were all destroyed in 1307. So that's still come down to us. We still have that in modern parlance, that is an unlucky day. But of course, I was going to say Freemasons, they're part of the same organization. The Templars were destroyed, and therefore a lot of their information would have been destroyed with them. And we don't know how much of this has survived the millennia. But I think Akhenaten knew a lot about this. That's why he dressed in that fashion, with his androgynous body, which looks like a modern Grey. If you're into sci-fi films, the modern Grey and Akhenaten look similar for a specific reason that was done deliberately. The Knights Templar would have known quite a lot about this, because they did formulate Arthurian legend, and Arthurian legend is full of a lot of this material, mainly about Jesus rather than the inner workings of the Nazarene. But nevertheless, they understood quite a lot of this information. But they were destroyed, of course, in 1307. And so they would have lost a lot of this information. And then we get the Freemasons, who were formulated afterwards. They only came into the open in 1717 with the establishment of Grand Lodge. I'm not sure that they actually understand much of the original import and ethos of that society, of that religion. I'm not sure how much of it has survived. But the original, if any of it has survived, would be about astronomy, astrology, the movements of the stars and the planets and the heavens above. So it was a study of astronomy, because that's where the gods came from. That's why you want to study it. The precession of the equinox. Will your listeners be familiar with precession?
Definitely.
Definitely. Good. Precession of the equinox is important because you can date things via the precession of the equinox. So as each sign of the zodiac changes every 2,200 years, you can date things via that change in the heavens above and the different symbols that go with it. And they were using that. I mean, that's why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men.
There seems to be a dearth of common knowledge among ordinary folk about the historicity of the zodiac, and how this diagram and symbols in particular has been sort of left out of and or shied away from in mainstream history discussions. In documentaries about the Christians and the Jews, one seldom ever hears about the zodiac being of any importance, for instance. What was the main hook that hypnotized and fascinated the ancients about the zodiac? And why was it such a hit with the renegades who spearheaded these religions that you speak of?
Yeah, I think it's because that's where the gods came from. I think it's because you can make a millennial calendar. So not just an annual calendar, but a millennial one. You can count off the centuries and the thousands of years. There is a possibility that this was tied into the second coming of the gods, would happen at a certain time. And you could date that time via the movements of the heavens and the precession of the equinox. So if the gods said they would come back in the age of Pisces, you would know exactly when it is. Or the age of Aquarius, the next great month is Aquarius. So just very quickly, the age of Taurus, the great month of Taurus, was 4,500 BC to about 1750 BC. Then we went to Aries, 1750 up to AD 10. Then Pisces from AD 10 up to 2350 AD. And then we go into Aquarius. And so, as I say, Jesus was born at the cusp between Aries and Pisces. That's why he was a Lamb of God who became a fisher of men. It's quite obvious he was following that tradition. But if you say, you know, the gods are going to come back in Capricorn, you know exactly when that will be, and you can count off the years to that time. I think that might be a part of why they were doing this. I mean, they were using it for prophecy, of course, on a sort of daily and annual basis, but I don't think that's the real reason for it. I think the real reason is deeper than that. And so we get this obsessive study of the heavens above. And so all the way back into Egypt. So if I do another quick screen share, here we go. Okay, so if I screen share, you should see an Egyptian image there.
We do.
Yes.
Okay, let me bring it to the top a little bit more because it's, there we go. This is Nut and Geb from Egypt. These are sort of the very ancient gods of Egypt, you know, from the very earliest days of Egypt. And we have Nut and Geb. Well, what is Nut and Geb? And I don't really see this when I read Egyptian reference books. I don't really see this mentioned. But look at Nut. She's got stars all over her body. And this is how if you go to the temples of Egypt, this is how it looks like. So who is she? Well, she is the Milky Way. And in fact, you can see the arms and legs on each side of the Milky Way either side. She is the Milky Way. This is what they were trying to draw and depict when they had the ancient gods of Egypt. It was all looking up to the heavens above. Studying the movement of the heavens. And
yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, and I've not seen this mentioned in any Egyptian reference book, and I don't know why, because it's so obvious. And this comes all the way down into the first century in Judea, because this is why I call the Church of Jesus and James Egypto-Judaic, because they came out of Egypt. Jesus went to Egypt for his education. He was known at that time as the Egyptian false prophet. And they carried this knowledge and veneration of the zodiac through into the first century. And again, you won't, I'm sort of mentioning viewers here. Viewers won't know about these zodiacs because they're not mentioned very much. So people don't know about them. Back when I started writing about this back in 2005 or something, this was sort of vaguely in the sort of pre-internet days. Internet wasn't very good. There was no wiki and things of that nature. I had to find out about these zodiacs in Judea from a Chinese paper in a Chinese journal, because no one really talks about them. But anyway, if you go around Judea, you find a lot of zodiacs. And this is Bet Alpha in Judea. This is first century, and it's not a very good one. This one, it's just rather, it's got caricatures of the zodiac. But this is in a synagogue, in a Jewish synagogue in Judea. This is the more famous one. Well, let's have a look at this one first. This is from Hukok. This is the Hukok zodiac, and you can't see much of it because it's largely been destroyed, but here down the bottom where my cursor is, that's Capricorn, Scorpio. What's that one? Yeah, that's Libra, the scales. And then in the center we have Helios, the sun god in the center of the zodiac. So this is just northwest of Galilee, again, first century. The better one is this one. This is the Hamat Tavera zodiac on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And this is again in a synagogue. It's a Judaic zodiac. You can see it's all in Aramaic Hebrew. And the interesting thing about this zodiac is it was owned by Jesus of Gamala. And Jesus of Gamala Saphias was his full name. And he was not only the governor of Tiberias in the AD 60s, but he was also the rebel leader of 600 rebel fishermen. Now, who was the leader of rebel fishermen in the first century? Called Jesus. Yeah, we're coming back to the biblical story here, the gospel story. Incongruously, in the center of this thing, because this is in a synagogue, we have Helios, the Greek sun god. What's he doing in a Jewish synagogue? And his head is pointing at the join between Aries and Pisces. So in processional terms, he's pointing at the turn of the first century, AD 10.
Wow.
So you can date this by procession. That's the whole idea of procession. You can date things by procession. And note also, he's holding in his left hand a blue-green spherical earth, holding in his gravitational grasp. So
now, I've heard you say that you can. I've heard you talk about this, where you can actually date with precession. But you've always seemed to mention it when it's like on the cusp. But do you have examples where they really are zoning into a very precise date, say in the middle of an age? Or
No, not so much. I think it's because these were the end and the beginning of epochs. These were very special times. These were the very times that people like the Nazarene were looking forward to in the Gospels. So when in the Gospels it says, this is the, yes, and anyway, yes, I can't quite find the verse, but it says that we are at the end of the age in the English translation, but it actually says the end of the eon in the Greek. And an eon is, well, you might say is something like a millennium or something. It's a large span of time. And so what he was talking about, of course, is the end of the age of the great month of Aries. That's what he was talking about. That was the end of the age that Jesus was talking about. And the beginning of the next age. And the next age is the great month of Pisces. And this is what they were looking to. These were very auspicious times when the great months changed from one house to another house. And so, yeah, these were momentous events, and that's why they portrayed them like that. But no, I've not seen them point at intermediate times. The zodiac at Dendera also points at the cusp between zodiac signs, not in the middle.
What I find really fascinating about these zodiacs is just how intelligent and learned these must have been to be able to read the constellations, to read the zodiac in the way that they did.
Yes.
And not only that, but they clearly understood the mechanics of the solar system, how the sun holds the earth in its gravitational grasp, and it's just mind blowing. It won't stop being mind blown for a long time. I don't think this is going to get old. Put it that way.
Yeah, and you can see here that the Helios character, this is the blue spherical Earth. You can see it's spherical because it's dark on one side and illuminated on the other, exactly the same as a sphere would be if you held it up to the light. And it has lines of latitude and longitude which are curved because they knew that this was on a sphere and it would look curved on a sphere. And so they've portrayed the Earth as a sphere being held by Helios, the sun god. So yeah, they knew the heliocentric model of the solar system.
It's absolutely phenomenal. And the people that try to say that the Earth is of any other shape, really, they need not only, they just need to look into the ancient texts and the knowledge that these people had in the past to realize that they were a lot smarter back then, and they weren't caught up with the tricks that society plays on people these days.
Yeah, and we can date this zodiac again because Josephus Flavius writes about it. He writes that he himself, because he was the army commander in command of Galilee, was sent to Galilee to destroy the heretical images of animals that lay in the palace 4 furlongs south of Tiberias. And of course, if you go 4 furlongs south of Tiberias, you come to this place, which has these heretical images of animals. So it's pretty obvious that Josephus Flavius was sent to destroy this zodiac at Hamat Devera. So again, we can date this zodiac quite well. And if we go on a few years,
comes from zoon, which is animal. It actually means animal.
Yeah, indeed. If we go on a few years to this one, this is a Christian zodiac. So this is Bet Shean, again just south of Galilee. And this is in a Christian monastery. And what they've done here, because they didn't want heretical images of animals, is they've changed the zodiac characters into men and made them months of the year. So now this is the calendrical zodiac with months, and you can read them off. So we're here in the Greek, we have on the left Aperilos, April, Mayos, May, Join, June, of course. Around here on the right, we've got Octobrios, and so it goes on. So we've got the complete year. And in the center, of course, we've got the sun and the moon in the center. But just a minute. Who is the king and the queen surrounded by 12 male disciples? This is an image of Jesus and Mary as the sun and the moon inside the signs of the zodiac, the 12 disciples of Jesus, because of course the disciples were based upon the signs of the zodiac. That's why there's 12 of them. That's why there were 12 knights of the round table. It's the same imagery. It's all to do with the zodiac. So here in a Christian monastery, we've got an image of Jesus and Mary together as the sun and the moon. Quite heretical, I would say.
Doesn't this remind you of Akhenaten and what he did back in Egypt as well?
Yeah, changing the religion, yes, taking control and changing the religion, very much the same. Again, not quite succeeding, but nevertheless being very influential because, you know, his legacy has come down through the millennia. The legacy of Akhenaten came down to us in terms of Judaic monotheism, and the legacy of Jesus has come down to us, of course, within Judaism and Christianity. But we still have this symbology today. And of course, if you don't know it's there, it flies right past you. This is how you can hold secrets in plain sight. You don't need to keep them secrets. You can just publish them. Because if people don't understand the symbolism, if they cannot engage with the symbolism because they don't have enough background knowledge to understand what it's talking about, then it will just fly right past them. And they've got no idea what you're talking about. And a classic example of...
I think it also serves a function because when they initiate a new member, say of their own bloodline, say they wait until the person's an adult, and then they say, oh, well, our secrets have been around you all the time. And then they explain what all of this stuff means. And then they say, so now you're a member with us, and now you know the secrets. And now you also have a inflated sense of self-importance because now you realize how everybody is hoodwinked around you. And so it'll give them a power trip, a power boost. And of course, they were special to start with because they're part of the bloodline. But now that they know the secret, they're just going to be power tripping like crazy. So
yeah. Or even just normal members being initiated within Freemasonry who are not part of the bloodline. That is a very powerful way of bringing people into secret societies, because those people, as you say, will suddenly go, oh, now I know what it was talking about. And they realize that there is hidden information. I mean, of course, they'll join the organization because they want to find out the other hidden information that's behind there as well. It's a very powerful tool for creating secret societies. It's been used throughout the millennia. This is another secret which has been held from us. Again, in plain sight because we all know the story. But this is Snow White, and Snow White is the moon. So this is, okay, it's a nice children's fairy tale, but it's also a tale of the cosmos. So Snow White is the Snow White moon, and she's followed by the 7 dwarf planets around the ecliptic. So the planets follow the moon around the ecliptic, just as these dwarfs follow Snow White. And the Wicked Witch was upset by Snow White, who was more beautiful than she was, whiter than white. I think the Wicked Witch was probably the Milky Way. She was Newt. But anyway, so she gives Snow White a corset, and she draws the corset in tighter and tighter and tighter to make Snow White thinner and thinner and thinner, which is exactly what happens to the moon as it goes round its orbit and approaches the sun. It gets thinner and thinner until the moon dies. It becomes the new moon. It's black, it's dead. And so Snow White is dead, or that's how she appears, until the charming prince comes along. And the charming prince, of course, is the sun god. And the charming prince kisses Snow White, which is exactly what happens in the heavens above. When you get a solar eclipse, the moon will kiss the sun and go in front of the sun. And they just happen to be exactly the same size. I mean, that had to be, you know, if you're an ancient looking at this had to be organized by the gods, that these two heavenly bodies in the heavens above are exactly the same size as you look at it. And then they pass in front of each other, and you get the, what do they call it? The signet ring, the diamond ring, where you get that gleam of the sun.
The corona.
Yeah, you can see the corona, but sometimes you get a flash of light on one side. It's like a diamond ring, the diamond ring of marriage. And so this is a consummation of this marriage between the sun and the moon.
And in your book, Mary Magdalene, you have a picture of a tree, and under the tree where there's a solar eclipse in the sky, and the light from the corona is shining through the tree, and the tree actually somehow makes 1,000,000 diamond rings on the ground.
Yeah, yeah. The leaves have enough gaps between them that you form pinhole cameras. And so you can pinhole camera that image on the ground below the tree, just like you would if you had used a pinhole camera and you had projected a little image on a screen. And it does exactly the same. And so after this consummation between the sun and the moon comes back to life. So Snow White comes back to life after she's kissed by the Sun Prince. And she gets fatter and fatter and fatter, of course, as if she is pregnant. So, you know, as a simple little fairy tale can hold within its meaning the entire sort of movement of the heaven and the moon in the heavens above, and the formation of a solar eclipse and everything is all held by this little fairy tale that nobody knows what it's talking about, because on the surface it's only talking about a prince and a princess, and it has no cosmic imagery at all unless you've been initiated into the secrets of this particular fairy tale. And that's what you can do with these stories. You can hold these mysteries within stories like Arthurian legend, which we will go into later because it's too long a story to go through it now. But yeah, so this story has been knocking around. This story of the heavens above has been just stop sharing that, has been a part of ancient religion and modern religions for millennia. We sort of lost most of it now because of what happened to Christianity. So we know this information was around in the 1st century and all the way up until the 4th century when some of these zodiacs were still being built. But Nazarene Judaism knew all about this, because these are Nazarene synagogues. But Christianity was created by Saul. And like I was talking about before, where Saul was not initiated into any of these mysteries, Saul was the apostle to the Gentiles. He had a very different Rome-friendly form of Judaism, and he had not been initiated into these mysteries. And so he didn't understand these mysteries, and what he didn't understand, he would destroy. And that's why Christianity doesn't hold any of these, overtly doesn't hold any of these secrets, because they were mostly sidelined and destroyed by Saul, because that's where we get Christianity from. And that's why we know so little about this. Is all courtesy of Saul, but there we go.
I was going to ask, we've already had some hints to it, but why was Jesus accused of being a revolutionary, of doing sorcery, and of being a soothsayer in the Talmud? And why was the Jewish revolt important anyway? We didn't really ever hear about this in Catholic school or in mass in church. What happened to Jesus when he was taken to Rome? And how did you find this out? Because I don't remember learning about this at all.
No, you wouldn't. In fact, nobody in the last 700 years has known anything about this. So I'm the first person to have discovered this in 700 years. The last people who knew about this were the Knights Templar. And I'm sure they knew about this because they crafted Arthurian legend. But the Knights Templar were destroyed, and so this information was destroyed along with it. And I don't know if anyone holds this information, apart from myself and my books, because this has to do with it has to do with Edessa, and we can't go into the Edessa story because it's a whole lecture on its own. It's like a 3-hour lecture just going through this, but you'll have to take it as read for the minute that the gospel story is linked to the Edessan story of the Edessan monarchy. And the Edessan monarchy started the Jewish revolt against Rome. Now, if you read Josephus, he will say it was the Adiabeni monarchy, and people get so upset by this because they'll say, oh, it's Adiabeni, nothing to do with Edessa. But the Syriac historians say that the queen of Adiabeni was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. This is an Edessan story. And it was these people who started the Jewish revolt against Rome. So this revolt, which even if you look in modern sort of classical reference books, they won't really tell you what the Jewish revolt was all about. They are highly unclear about what the real goals were. But it's pretty obvious if you read the history of Edessa. Well, the reason they don't know is that because they disregard Edessa, and they've not heard of the history of Edessa. And so they disregard Edessa from this story. But the goal of the Edessan monarchs were to take over Rome. It didn't really have much to do about Judea, this story. It was mainly to do about a revolt against Rome. And well, we even get this from the gospel story, just, without treading on this story too much because it's too long to go into. But even, the parables, something like the parable of the the vineyard owner within the Gospels. Jesus gives this parable, and he says that a landowner plants a vineyard and gives it to a tenant and goes away to a far country. And then when the harvest is due, he sends his ambassadors down to the tenant asking for his money. He wants his rent. And the tenant won't pay any rent. And he abuses his ambassadors and eventually kills one of them. And so Jesus says to the people listening to this parable, he says, well, what will we do with these evil tenants who will not pay their rent? We should kill them. And you think, hold on a minute. Why is the man of the people, Jesus, giving this parable about killing tenants who won't pay their rent on time, paying their rent to absentee landlords who are not even there? What's that got to do with the Jesus story? And of course, people will gloss over this and they'll try and give some highfalutin explanation about, I don't know, the tenant is the church or something of this nature, whatever. What it's actually saying is that all of this, the Jewish revolt, the gospel story, are all intermingled. The gospel story is about the Jewish revolt. And so this is the Jesus character saying to his people, what you need to do to again, it's one of these stories, one of these histories that is hidden in plain sight. All you need to do to understand the story is to replace.
Is calling Rome the tenant?
Yeah, Rome is the tenant. Yeah, absolutely. And the landowner is the Edessan monarch. So as an Edessan monarch, they thought that they owned these lands because this is where they were based. They were based in northern Syria, and they thought that they owned all of Syria, and the Queen of Edessa had become the Queen of the Jews in Judea in AD 50. They thought they owned all of the Near East. It was their lands. And they had rented out, as it were, their lands to the Romans. And they were expecting Rome to pay rent for being on their lands. But of course, Rome stuck up a middle finger to the Edessans and said, well, actually, you owe us rent. So what this Jesus character is saying, what this Edessan character is saying, is that the Romans are on our lands and we are due rent from the Romans. But when we send our ambassadors to Rome, they not only will not pay any rent, but they kill our ambassadors and they ask rent from us. What evil tenant asks for rent from the landlord? And therefore we should kill these evil Romans. It is a call to arms.
They had the feeling of entitlement to the land, but they also had the sense of self-importance due to their bloodline, which was the Egyptian bloodline and the Parthian bloodline, and both of those are very prestigious in those days, right?
Yeah, we'll have to go through this later because it's too long a story to go through it now. But these Edessans were related to the Egyptian royal line, to the Roman royal line, to the Greeks, and to the Parthians. And so these were the most well-connected royals in the whole of the known world at this time. And so, of course, they did have a claim to the whole of these lands, not only Judea and Syria, but they had a claim to all of Parthia and all of Rome.
But that didn't just make them mutts?
No, but nevertheless, the throne of Rome was empty. This was the whole point of the Jewish revolt. The throne of Rome was empty. Nero was dead by AD 68. And so whoever had the largest treasury and the largest army could take the throne of Rome. That's how Rome worked at this time. They didn't have a good succession between between administrations. This is the whole point we're seeing even today in America. The most important thing you can have with a nation or an empire is to get the succession right between one leader and the next leader. And Rome, for a long time, never had a very good way of choosing the next emperor. And on this occasion, it was just open to whoever had the largest army could become the next emperor. So it was the year of 4 emperors, where 4 emperors came and went. They all put their hat into the ring and said, you know, I'm going to be the next emperor. And then they were killed by the next one. So 4 emperors came and went. And what I'm saying in my works is there was not 4 emperors, there was 5. So this was the year of 5 emperors. And the 5th emperor was this king of Edessa, who's called King Esus Manu. And he is the guy who started this revolt against Rome. And so you ended up with a battle in Judea between Commander Vespasian and this Edessan king, which is known as the Jewish Revolt. And whoever won this battle would become the next emperor. So this was a battle for the throne of Rome. That's why it was so important. That's why so many people were writing about this event. And the Edessans lost. It was Vespasian who won. So he sailed to Rome to become the next emperor. Even though he was a nobody, he had no royal blood, he had no oracle on his side, he was a complete nobody, but he had just defeated this king of Edessa in Judea, and so now he became the next emperor. That was the importance of this particular battle. And so what happened to these people afterwards? Well, they were taken in chains to Rome. And one of my critics, I don't know why this critic has a thing about this, he says that the Edessan monarchy were the allies of Rome. And I'm thinking, how on earth could you say that these people were allies of Rome? These were the people who destroyed the Legion of Cestius at the outbreak of the war in AD 66. They destroyed an entire Roman legion. And then when they surrendered to Titus in Jerusalem. And Titus says that he extended his right arm of security to these people if they would surrender. And so this critic says, oh, well, therefore they were allies because Titus didn't kill them and was being respectful and allowed them to surrender. So therefore they were allies. And you think, hold on a minute, what planet are you on? Some of my critics really don't understand history. Sometimes it's not advantageous to kill your enemy. I mean, we did that with Napoleon Bonaparte. We did exactly the same. Britain defeated Napoleon the first time and sent him into exile. They didn't kill him because he had too many supporters in France. So they sent him into exile, into Elba. But then he escaped from Elba and started another revolution. And so we had to defeat him again at the Battle of Waterloo. And again, we did not kill Napoleon. We took him prisoner. We extended our right arm of security to Napoleon and sent him down to St. Helena instead. St. Helena is a little tiny island down in the South Atlantic where he could never escape from. But he was not killed. Why? Because he had too many supporters still in France. And if you kill their leader, then perhaps you will just eventually start another revolt. And so you've just defeated the whole object of defeating the first revolt by starting another one. So what's the point? You might as well just allow this person to survive and keep him in house arrest in some secure location. And
this is leading right to my last question.
Yeah, what happened to this guy?
I want you to talk about Fortress Diwa because this is really interesting. And it's interesting where it's located too. It's located in Chester, England, which is right outside of Wales. And it's actually not too far away from where my clan is from. And this is the banner of my clan, the Clan Lamont.
Ah. Oh, well, there you go. You've got the Red Hand as well.
Yes.
The Red Hand of Ireland, yes, of
Yeah,
Northern Ireland.
we trace lineage back to the uh, O'Neill clan, which is spelt more like Unile. I'm not sure the correct pronunciation of that, but it's basically, you can say, O'Neill clan of Northern Ireland, and they trace all the way back to the kings of Tara. I have the whole lineage drawn out.
Yeah. Yeah, that all ties into my Scota, Egyptian Queen of the Scots, because that's where she ended up, is Northern Ireland and so on. So yeah, that ties in. But yeah, the story of Fortress Diva or Diva, I should say, is interesting. It's spelt with a W, but in Latin they normally pronounced it as a V, so it normally comes out as Diva. What happened to these people? Well, we know they were taken to Rome in chains, so
Yes,
they were
tell
not
us about that.
allies. Sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, I said yes. Tell us about that.
Yeah, they were taken to Rome in chains by Emperor Vespasian because they were defeated. What we don't know is what happened to them after that time, but we do know that Rome had an age-old policy of not necessarily killing your enemies. Some they did, many they didn't. So if you look at people like Caractacus, who was the king of the Britons who was fighting against Rome, he wasn't killed. He was taken to Rome and held under house arrest. And given he wasn't held in a dungeon, with a bucket of gruel every day, he was held under house arrest with every luxury that Rome could give him.
What was that movie like? It might have been a Godfather movie, where one of these mafia guys is in prison, and he's got a life term, but it shows his prison room, and he's got like this luxurious bed and dresser and everything, and
Yep.
he's got meals, like culinary meals coming to him.
Yeah, I think that's because of a different reason. I think that's because the jailers know, because the jailers live in the outside world. And if they disrespect that particular prisoner, then maybe some of his supporters will pay them a visit. And it won't be a very friendly visit. And so everyone has to be friendly to this guy in prison because they have to live in the outside world where his supporters are.
But there could be an element of that in this story as well, don't you think?
Yeah, depending on how powerful his supporters were, that's why he didn't kill him, because there were too many supporters of this revolt character back in Judea. And of course, Rome didn't want to promote another revolt, which actually happened later because they had another one. They had the Bar Kokhba uprising another 60 years later. But the idea was to prevent any further revolts in the east of the empire by not killing this guy, but by taking him and putting him in a prison. Exactly the same as America has done with Guantanamo Bay. And so Fortress Diva was a very large first century Guantanamo Bay because it's a very strange fortress. I think I've got a picture of it here. Well, a diagram. Obviously, it doesn't
They
exist
do a lot
anymore.
of nasty things to the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, but I don't think they build temples for their prisoners.
No, that's true. They haven't built any temples for them yet. But you never know. That might be next on the list. Um, So if I share this screen.
There we go.
We got it.
Okay. So this is Fortress Diva, which, as you say, is up in Chester, which is on the northwest side of England, modern England, on the Welsh borders. And that is a problem because nobody knows why it is there. Because it is not in a very favorable location for a fortress. There was no reason for the fortress to be there. It was like it was hiding away behind forests and marshes on the borders of Wales, and nobody knows why you would want to put one there. And it was much bigger than most fortresses, and inside it we had this structure here. Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Anyway, right
Yes.
in the center, just slightly to the left, there is an unusual building there. In fact, a whole range of unusual buildings. So this fortress had an extra accommodation block, an extra sort of exercise yard, an extra bathhouse, which is unusual. No other fortress had two bathhouses, and this temple. It wasn't quite known what this structure was at first, but it's fairly obvious to me that this is a temple. And fortresses didn't have temples inside them because they're not necessary for the protection of the soldiers. So why did this fortress have all of these extra elements inside it? I think it's because this was a prison fortress. It was a Guantanamo Bay. And the whole point of this fortress was to guard these dangerous rebels who were now incarcerated in Fortress Diva. And the reason, because this fortress was built by Vespasian, it was built 2 years after this revolt ended. So it was coincident with this Jewish revolt. And it was built in a strange location as far as you could possibly get from Judea. So if you look at the Roman Empire, which is way out in the east of the empire, if you go west, northwest in the Roman Empire, as far as you can before dropping off the end of the world, you come to Chester. And it seems to me quite deliberate that they've built this place as far from the power base of these people as they possibly could, to separate them from their power base so they wouldn't have any further influence in the Near East. Exactly the same as we did to Napoleon when we sent him down to St. Helena, as far away as you could possibly get from France. It's the same rationale. So this is Fortress Diva, and a lot of it is still there. This is the wall. This is partly the original Roman wall, still there in Chester. This is the north wall of that particular fortress, still there 2,000 years later. So yeah, it survived. And the interesting thing in the center of this fortress was this temple. And the reason I think this is linked, because we've been looking at these zodiacs, we know that the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James were highly connected with the zodiac, is because I think this is a temple of the zodiac, and that would link it up with the Nazarene Jews in the east of the empire, because this this temple is a Vesica Piscis. So let's have a look at the Vesica Piscis. Let's make that a bit bigger. This is a Vesica Piscis. The one on the right is the standard. And I've had critics say, this temple cannot be a Vesica Piscis because it's not bisecting at the half circle. So if you look on the right hand side, we've got two intersecting circles, and they intersect each other halfway across their diameter, so at their centers. So you get one half of the circle outside and one half of the circle inside this shaded area, the vesica piscis. And that is a standard vesica piscis. And they say, well, the temple's not that, and therefore it's not a vesica piscis, and so your theory is wrong. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute. You can make a vesica piscis with a different intersection if you wish, and that's what they've done. So all they've done here on the left hand, this is the Fortress Diva design. The design of this temple is based upon the intersection of two circles. And all they've done is they've pushed these circles slightly closer together. So you get 1/4 outside and 3/4 inside the vesica piscis. And it's quite obvious they've done that because it makes a fatter courtyard in the center, which is much more usable as a temple enclosure.
Yeah, you have more space, right?
Yeah, you've got more space inside, so it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do as an architect. Squeeze them together a bit because it's still a vesica piscis. And the interesting thing about this is that this was made in Egyptian cubits, Egyptian royal cubits. And you know, if you read the report on, because they've done the archaeology on this site and they measured it all, and they were looking for the measurements of it, and they couldn't find any Greek or any Roman measurements that suited this, and so they thought the size of this was random, but it's not random. It was made in Egyptian royal cubits. Now, who would be using Egyptian cubits? Well, of course, the Israelites and the Jews would, because they were the cubits that the Israelites used. It says so in the Old Testament. The cubit used for the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant was the Egyptian royal cubit. It says so in the Torah. so we've got an idea that this temple could be Judaic, Nazarene Judaic. And who used the vesica piscis as the symbol of his religion? Oh, yes. It was Jesus, of course.
Also,
so again,
if you look at the north pole or the north star,
yes,
you have the circle which goes around the North Star, and you have the circle nearby which goes around the North Pole of the ecliptic,
yes,
which is the path of the sun, and that creates two circles which are two separate spheres to measure in the sky, and that could also create a vesica piscis.
It is, yeah.
Yes.
That is the origin of the vesica piscis. So that's why this diagram on the right here is not actually the correct one. This is more the correct one. So what we have here is, let's look at the one on the left-hand side. We have the circle of the celestial sphere, exactly as you were saying, and the circle of the ecliptic circle. These are the two circles you will see in the heavens above. These are the two circles which were known in Greece as the wagon wheels of the celestial wagon. You can see there's two wheels and they intersect each other. And where they intersect forms the vesica piscis. So exactly as you said, yeah, it's the two great wheels in the heavens above, the celestial sphere and the ecliptic sphere. Where they intersect forms this shape. So we're back to looking at the heavens again.
And Jesus was supposed to be the fisher king, and the vesica piscis is also known as the fish mouth.
Yes.
There's another tie-in to the Loki thing, because we talked about what if Akhenaten and Loki have a relation due to that part of the myth, but Loki was also known as the inventor of fishnets.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting, because that's closely connected with the story of the Elagabal, which we've not been through yet, but that's another interesting story. And the Elagabal was covered in a fishnet. So yeah, someone who knows
right.
these sagas should investigate that, because it looks like there might be something
Is the
interesting to find.
Eligabal is a comet? Oh, dude. And
Yeah, it's a meteorite.
Novocastrian, I know you had a question about you wanted to bring this up about the basaltic pillars. And what does it look like if you look at the basaltic pillars from the top down?
Could you clarify, just to remind me how this
Okay,
question went?
so the pillars of Hercules, um, the what was the one, the bridge of Fingal, or not, yeah, Finn McCool,
Fingal's Cave.
but
It's on the island of Stafford.
the bridge he was building.
Ah, yes.
Ah, yes, it goes from the Giant's
Fingal's Cave is
Causeway. Yeah.
kind of covered with grass on the top, but there's other ones where you can walk on the top and it's geometrical, um, sort of like a hexagonal pattern.
Yeah, that's the Giant's Causeway.
Giant's
It goes,
Causeway.
yeah, it goes from Northern Ireland up to Fingal's Cave.
That's right, yeah.
It could resemble a net from the top
Yeah,
down.
that's true. I've not thought about that. That would certainly look like a net. Yeah. Yeah,
Not to
we haven't
mention
been through this.
the net there, the spheres, or the circles, the concentric circles which form the Pisces, continue to have even more concentric circles, and the measurement lines in between them. That's another net-ish, kind of like.
Yeah, there's also a net on the twin pillars of Yakin and Boaz that stood at the entrance to the Temple of Solomon. And they had spheres of the earth and the cosmos on the top of those pillars. And on top of those, again, was netting. So there's some more cosmic netting as well. So, yeah, all very interesting stuff. So going back to the Temple of the Zodiac in Chester, this is interesting because this is an artist's impression of what it looked like inside. This is AD 72 in Britain. Remember that Britain had only been conquered in AD 43, so it was a new part of the Roman Empire. And at this time, this temple in this fortress was the most prestigious, the most luxury building in the whole of Britain. A lot of money had been spent on this particular temple. And you've got to wonder why inside a fortress, which is normally very utilitarian, you've got this enormous amount of money being spent on this huge, great Temple of the Zodiac. And I call it a Temple of the Zodiac because, of course, if you look at it here, it's divided into 12 segments. And it is, as you say, a vesica piscis, which is connected with Pisces.
Wales at this time was still unconquered by the Romans, wasn't it?
Yeah.
How far was the fortress from the frontier line?
Well, I'm not sure how big a frontier it was. I mean, it was right next. I mean, we're talking 10 kilometers, as it were, from the front line. But when they excavated the temple, the pipework, the lead, was Welsh lead. So at the very least, they were trading with the Welsh and saying, can you supply us with lead? And obviously we'll pay you. And they were trading with the Welsh to get their lead and their slate, because they were using slate from North Wales.
So you can't say that Wales has nothing to do with the Arthurian legend.
Yeah, they were using lead and slate from Wales. So although they hadn't conquered Wales at this time, they were certainly trading with Wales. And Wales was probably doing quite nicely from this because they had goods they could sell. They also had copper. The biggest copper mine in the whole of Europe is in North Wales there, up at Llandudno. So they would have had copper as well. And of course, so Wales would have benefited considerably because they could then purchase all of the luxuries that Rome could offer. Things like glassware and olive oil and wine and all of the other marvelous things that Rome had. So there was a lot of trade going on with them. So this was the Temple of the Zodiac at Fortress Diwa, and this is a 3D rendition of what it was supposed to look like. So it was a true sort of Vescabiscus.
Whoa.
Very interesting structure.
They
And the
even
only
get to
people,
look up at the sky through the middle.
yeah, yeah, you've got a good view of the heavens above as well. And the only people who would want a structure like this would be the Nazarene Jews, who had just been defeated in the Jewish revolt and were now languishing in England as the guests of the Roman Emperor, never allowed to leave. And this was their bathhouse. Who in the Roman Empire would not bathe with Romans? Yeah, it was the Jews. So yeah, this is why they had a separate bathhouse down here.
Well, would it be too far-fetched to say that if so they were in contact with Welsh people? The Wales would have probably been in contact with Ireland, and as far as we know, at that time, Ireland was still ruled by the descendants of Scotia.
Yes, if they had understood their history, yes, they would have been.
And they would be distant cousins to the prisoner.
Yes.
Yeah. There might have been some intrigue there that we'll never know.
Yeah, and some traditions that remained, because they would have known, people in the local area would have known that this important person from Judea was being held in this region. Now, Jesus was not famous as a religious person at this time, AD 1st century, but nevertheless, they would have known that this important king was being incarcerated in this fortress. And there would have been lots of rumors and mythologies about this important king, especially if he was known at this time as being a son of God and things of this nature. So yeah, there would have been lots of mythologies spiraling around this region, and they would have settled maybe in Wales and and Ireland, quite possibly.
What's also amazing, I think, about this is that if the temple used royal cubits, it indicates that they let King Jesus design and build this for himself.
Yes.
Which indicates that he was a mason.
Oh, he was, yes. That's why he was known as a tecton. So in the gospel story, he's not called a carpenter. He's called a tecton. And a tecton in Greek is a mason. And an etheirotecton is a Freemason. So Jesus in the gospel story is a Freemason.
And that was mistranslated, wasn't it?
Yeah, deliberately mistranslated. So the raising of Lazarus is a third degree initiation. It wasn't bringing Lazarus back from the dead. It was a standard third degree initiation, the same as I went through when I became a master mason, where you die, you're buried for 3 days, and then you're resurrected from the dead while being hoodwinked. And that's exactly what happens to Lazarus.
And if he was doing the raising, it means that he was a master mason.
A grandmaster, someone of his importance. If he was a king and he was known as the King of the Jews, and we'll go through how he was connected to the Edessan monarchy, then yes, he would have been grandmaster. And so yes, he would have known how to build, to lay out, because this temple was laid out with 2 enormous great circles. That's how you lay it out, with 2 large circles. He would have known how to lay out the image of this temple, the ground plan of it. Now, the interesting thing that follows on from this, which again confirms this is something to do with the Jewish revolt, is this temple, very, very expensive temple, was built in the early AD 70s. And in the AD 90s, so just 20 years later, it was destroyed. They pulled it down. Why? Well, because it had no function anymore. The people it was incarcerating were now all dead. And so in the late AD 90s, it was pulled down. It was destroyed. And that area of land was never used again for the next 120 years. And then in 220 AD, they rebuilt it. The same edifice. They rebuilt it all over again, except they rebuilt it in a slightly different fashion. So here's the first one. Here's the first. Let me see if I can center this a little bit better. This is the first Temple of the Zodiac in Fortress Diva. And the layout circles were 70 Egyptian cubits in diameter. So they were using, as we said, Egyptian cubits. And it was laid out as a quarter outside the circle and 3/4 inside as the Vesica Piscis. So that was the layout of the first one. The second one, the ground plan is exactly the same size, but they just made different sized circles. So this time the circles are 80 Egyptian cubits, and they pushed them together a bit more. So you've got 1/7 outside the circle and 6/7 inside the circle to make the Temple of the Zodiac a little bit fatter. But it's still got 12 partitions. It's still a Temple of the Zodiac, and it's still a Vesica Piscis, so it's still dedicated to Pisces and so on, and to the cosmos, because it is the ecliptic and the celestial sphere. And they rebuilt it. So why would you go to the bother of destroying it only to rebuild it again?
Just a speculation. If one of the circles represents the zodiac or the ecliptic, and the other represents the celestial sphere, that the 12 partitions are built with half of the partitions in one circle and half of the partitions in the other. I don't know if they might have tried to blend constellations, half of the constellations being zodiacal constellations and the other half being, say, like galactic constellations or something like that.
Well, you end up with something that is similar to the, I'm not sure I've got an image of it here, the Dendera zodiac. I'll come back to that in a minute, because I do have an image somewhere of the Dendera zodiac, which has these two circles on it. And you can see how they've blended the zodiac signs into these two circles on the Dendera zodiac, because that is a processional zodiac and it has the celestial circle and the ecliptic circle on it. It's a very interesting blend of how they've got them together. But just to finish this conundrum here, why did they rebuild it in about 220, 225, no, maybe even 230 AD? It's because another Jesus became emperor of Rome, or another Edessan monarch became the emperor of Rome. Sorry, I missed that.
So I was just saying, I see.
Yeah. Yes, because you remember the Edessan monarch, the King Esus Manu guy, was a king of Edessa, which is just in northern Syria, just north of north of Aleppo. And they were a very powerful dynasty in the 1st century AD, but they got defeated by Rome, and so they were knocked on the head, and they weren't so powerful very much after that. Just below them, just below Damascus at Homs and Hama, we have the Emesa dynasty. Sounds similar, and I think they must be related, but I've still not managed to find out exactly how they're related. So we have Edessa and Emesa, two royal families in two principalities. right next door to each other, one in northern Syria, one in southern Syria. And in the 2nd century AD, 220s, the Emessan monarchy became emperors of Rome under Septimus Severus, and Julia Domna, the indomitable queen of the Emessans. And then their most famous emperor was Emperor Elagabalus, who was the priest of the Elagabal stone. So we'll have to do a talk on the Elagabal stone, the sacred meteorite of the world, really. This is a meteorite that's been around all sorts of places.
Even despite that, they didn't have enough weight to knock out the St. Paul version of Christianity in favor of the Syrian? Or would they even want to?
What do you mean in the 3rd century, in the 220s?
Yes, when they got their emperors in.
Yeah, this is exactly what he tried to do. So the Jesus character, we've already said, was a Galilean. He was a eunuch Galilean priest of Cybele. Well, Elagabalus was exactly the same. He was a Galilean. He was a eunuch priest of the Elagabal stone. So he was well known for castrating himself and becoming a eunuch. He became a Galilean, which didn't go down very well in Rome, because in Rome, castration was illegal. It was against the law. And now you've got an emperor who was castrated. So that didn't go down very well. And he violated the Vestal Virgins and various other things. So he was not.
Sorry. Wasn't Emperor Elagabalus, castrated at a young age?
Yes, because some of these priests were, like Saint Peter, probably was castrated at a young age. We know this from Arthurian legend. We'll go through this later, but we get a parallel with the Percival story, that Peter was probably castrated at a young age. And Peter, of course, was linked to this because his title was the Stone. Okay, so his name was not Peter. We know him as Peter, but he wasn't called Peter. He was Simon. But he was given the title of Peter Kephas, meaning the stone. And it wasn't because he was the stone upon which the kingdom of heaven will be built. It was because he was the keeper of the Elagabal stone, which the Edessans held at that time. The Elagabal stone was in Edessa. But in the 3rd century, with the Emperor Elagabalus, the Elagabal stone was now in Emesa. And we know it was there because we have images of it. So very quickly, we might dash across to, if I unshare, and if I quickly look for some stone imagery, because I know I've got some stones here somewhere.
As you were talking about Edessa, and slightly to the south, there was a Mesa. This actually isn't too far away from Salonika either, is it? And I don't know if that ties into the story at all.
Saloniki, you mean Saloniki in Greece?
Thessalonica, which I think is now Istanbul. It changed from, I think it was Thessalonica, then it became Constantinople, and then it became Istanbul, if I'm remembering right.
No, Thessalonica is in northern Greece, so it's west of Constantinople. It's a smaller town. It's right at the top of Greece on the Mediterranean is Thessalonica. Very nice town, actually. Been there a few times.
Constantinople's not far away from Edessa. Right?
Constantinople is on the bridge between Asia and Europe, and that was the big city of the Byzantines. That became Istanbul. But Thessalonica is a different town. But let's have a look at, see if we can find an Elagabal for you. Here's an Elagabal, without going through the whole story, because going through the story will take at least an hour or so. If I share this screen, people will be able to see what an Elagabal looks like. So now you should get a coin coming up. Did that come up?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I can't see it on my screen, so, which is a bit awkward. Anyway, let's center that up. So that is the Elagabal stone. It's a conical meteorite, and it's not very big. It's only about, in American terms, it's about 2 foot tall, I think, something of that nature. So it wasn't very big, no more than a meter high, because you could put it in a chariot without squashing the chariot. So it can't have been that heavy. Conical, quite small, black stone, meteorite, and you can see it's embossed with the image of the phoenix on it. So that's the body of the phoenix in the middle, and you've got 2 wings either side, and then you've got his leg and a tail on the bottom. That's the phoenix. So it's embossed with the image of the phoenix, meaning this stone is connected with the sun. It's a small piece of the sun that broke off and fell to earth. It was a meteorite. And of course, when meteorites come in, they're flaming with fire, just like the phoenix bird did. And this was you can see it in a temple here. This is the sacred stone that went all around Europe, was venerated by many different monarchs. And it was finally taken to Rome by Emperor Elagabalus. And this is the Elagabal stone when it was in Rome. So here again, this is a coin of Elagabalus, of course. So you can see him here if I swap to this one. This is Emperor Elagabalus, the emperor from Emesa in Syria, who was a galley priest. He was the eunuch galley priest of the Elagabal stone. And this is his Elagabal. And you can see again, it's a conical stone, embossed with the image of the phoenix. It's in a chariot being pulled along the streets of Rome by a quadriga chariot, 4 horses. So it can't have been too heavy, otherwise it would squash the chariot. This was the sacred stone of the Egyptians. We'll go through this later because it went to Egypt, it went to Greece, it went to Parthia, and then it ended up with the Edessan and Emessan monarchies in Syria. And then we don't know what, it went to Rome, but then we don't know what happened to it. It disappeared. But I was quite amazed. Someone is either reading my books, which is possible, or they know something about this history. Because I was sitting in a cinema watching a James Bond film, as you do. And this was the James Bond film where they were chasing each other across North Africa for some strange reason. I don't even remember the plot of this film. I really wasn't concentrating very much. And then Bond gets captured. Him and his female sidekick gets captured. And they're taken to an observatory in this meteor crater in North Africa somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you remember which one that was? I can't remember which Bond film
Yes,
that
this
was.
is Spectre.
Spectre, there you go. And so they get taken into this observatory and they are shown the Elagabal stone.
Yeah.
And at that point, I fell off my chair and everyone was looking around at me because what? Here's me falling off my chair. What on earth is the Elagabal stone doing in a Bond film? And it had nothing to do with the plot in the film, as far as I could see. It had absolutely nothing to do with the film whatsoever. And then there was this voiceover saying that this is the most ancient rock in the whole of the universe or something.
I thought in the film, they did it very cleverly because they try and link it up with the psychology of the main antagonist.
Right.
And
yes.
Yeah.
He was some sort of astronomer or something, wasn't he, or something?
Yes, and he was fascinated with the destructive power of the comet and admired it, but also felt an empathy towards it. and how lonely it was, and all of this. But just the idea that his psychology is linked with this catastrophic event is enough to give you an insight into how these people, tyrants like these, how they think.
Yeah, but why was it in a Bond film?
No, yes. So go on.
I mean, I don't know, but obviously someone within the production team knows something about the Alagabal, or has read my books, or something of that nature, and decided to include this within a Bond film to preserve its imagery, to preserve its history, perhaps, and its power, and its spiritual sort of nature, its ethereal sort of nature. I don't know, but there must be some sort of rationale behind why this image was included in this film, and I really don't know.
I had another question
what's your
for
guess?
you. Okay, I had another question for you earlier, and I was going to ask if you knew the power of the zodiac, you also know how to misuse that. And the people who understand the zodiac know that there are certain cycles where they are more likely to be great catastrophes on a massive scale. And because of that, they can time their attacks, they can time their conquests with these upheavals. And that in and of itself, with this antagonist in the film, he's likening himself to the comet because he can maneuver around it. He can use it as a weapon. That was my reading.
Yeah, well, like everything that has power, you can use it for good or bad, I suppose. But
right.
We don't fully know what the power of this stone is, apart from its esoteric, spiritual sort of influence over people. My guess is that it was magnetic. It was an iron-rich meteorite, and therefore it was magnetic. And a magnetic force would be very mysterious to ancient people. They wouldn't necessarily understand how this force operated. And I wondered if that was it.
Also, if anything, the stone itself could signify the highest degrees of initiation because of the associations which you mentioned earlier. They named that initiation after the stone, and and so the highest level of initiation for them was being initiated into the goddess, the inner sanctum of the goddess, right? But and then also something having to do with the stone. I don't know how the stone connects with the goddess, but it was both. It was the stone and the goddess, which were key parts of the final stage.
Yes, we don't sort of know why Kibel was linked to the stone, but she was linked to this stone. There's the story of the city in Anatolia. I can't remember what the name of the city was now. And there was a black stone there, which was thought to be the Elagabal, but I don't think it was the real one because there were lots of copies, of course. And that was taken to Rome in the 3rd century, I think, BC. It was in Pessinus, I think, in the center of Anatolia. And there was a famous story about the black stone, the sacred black stone of Kibel that was in that town, and it was taken to Rome. But I'm not entirely sure that that was the real one. That might have been one of the many copies that have been knocking around. There was another copy in Cyprus as well, quite a famous one in Cyprus. So yeah, that's part of the story. We haven't been through it all, of the sacred stone, which runs through the gospel story and ancient history in all sorts of places. So yeah, it's an interesting story. So yeah, I think we're almost at the end of this. Oh, we didn't go through the last of the eunuch pieces, and since we've been talking about eunuchs, we might as well go through this. As we were saying, I better tee up another image. Let's see if I can find that image.
Take your time. When you were talking about Kybel there, I remembered the statue of Kybel, and I remembered she had a tower on her head. And I also remember, so I can't remember who was talking about it now, but the tower being represented, especially on the head, being representative of the higher knowledges of this, the celestial sphere. And I wondered, why would they worship the tower as a woman? Woman, the goddess was the keeper of the knowledge of the high celestial sphere when there were going to be these great cycles, and when the tower falls, it falls on you, right? So you don't want the tower to fall. You worship the tower. You don't want the celestial sphere to fall on you. You don't want these great upheavals to affect your people. So you better worship this woman, otherwise she will topple upon you.
I'm not sure if that's the rationale or not. I mean, initially, these were known as mural crowns, the crown of the city walls. So it wasn't so much a tower as a city wall.
Okay.
And so Kybel Rhea, she quite often had the city walls on her head, and so did Tyche Fortuna, and so did Roma. So there's quite a lot of these goddesses had the city walls crown, which is known as a mural, which was for the protection of the town. So these goddesses were venerated because they would protect the town with their city walls. But if you're looking at it as being...
Oh, sorry. That the Romans actually found out about, or it might have been, no, it was something the Novocastrian shared with me. The Romans learned about Cybele when they were fighting Hannibal and in Carthage, and then they brought the cult back to Rome, which lasted until some people were getting pissed off that their sons were coming home without balls.
Oh, right.
And they outlawed it.
Ah, that's when they outlawed castration. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that story. But if you're looking at the turreted crown as being a tower, then of course we might have links to Mary Magdalene because she was the princess of the tower as well. So you might find that Mary Magdalene was being portrayed as an incarnation of Kybel, perhaps. It's possible. I've not looked into that, but it is possible that the tower symbology was something to do with Kybel.
I had a question surrounding that, but it would have to include an introduction to Mary Magdalene.
Yeah,
maybe we get into that next time. Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that next time. But just to finish off the eunuchs and their links to Jesus and so on, we know an amount about these eunuchs because we have various accounts from chroniclers. And the first of these is how they made themselves eunuchs. And this was done during a ceremony. So this comes from Pseudo-Lucian. And he says, on these days, he's talking about the ceremony they have. On these days, men become the Galli, the Galileans. For while the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout and takes up a sword. And he grabs the sword and immediately castrates himself. Then he rushes through the city holding his testicles in his hands, and he takes female clothing and women's adornments from whatever house he throws the testicles into. So these were known as the testicle tossers. And this is how they became Galileans. And of course, remember that Jesus was a Galilean. And then we get a description from Josephus Flavius of these Galileans because they were operating during the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s. And so Josephus Flavius says of these Galileans, the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments, and they smeared their faces with ointments so they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands. And while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors. And they drew their swords from under their finely decked dresses and ran everybody through whom they alighted upon. That's from Jewish War 4:9-10. And so from the description by Josephus, we know what these people would have looked like. And they, if I can just bring you up again, there we go. If we do a share screen. So that should be a square, I'll say that again, a screen share of a stone. Well, this is what they would have looked like. So this would be a Galilean. They would have looked something like this. These are the Hijra from modern India, who do exactly the same as the Galileans. They still castrate themselves and they dress up as women and they indulge in fortune telling and things of that nature.
Wow. And they even have the coronated tower on
yes, she's got a tower headdress as well. Yeah. Yes, I thought that was quite fun. They've got the headdress of Kibel on their heads. It's good, isn't it? A lot
is
of
there
these
an etymological link between Kabbalah and Sibel or Kibel?
I don't know. I sort of vaguely looked into that. I couldn't see one, but if anyone has any good ideas about that, perhaps they could have a discussion with it, maybe on my Facebook site or something. But yes, I don't know if there's any connection between the Kabbalah and Kibel. I don't know on that.
Do they still go into a frenzy and start killing
well, they certainly
every man
they're known for their dancing and so on, because you invite these people. Their whole rationale for their being is not because they're just slightly effeminate men who like dressing up as women, but they have an entire sort of industry based upon them being invited to marriages and things of that nature and other celebrations and so on, where they are, like you might think of a gypsy troupe being invited, and they are the entertainment. So they are the musicians and the dancers, and they bless the the bride and the groom and all the rest of it. So they're still an integral part of society, being a part of the entertainment industry, I suppose you might say. And so they have a fairly good living as being Galilean, what we might call them, eunuchs, primeval Adams,
castrati.
Castratos, yes, androgynous,
so
whatever.
You know that the men would get in a frenzy and run around tossing their balls. Was there any evidence that the actual female members would get into any sort of frenzy themselves at any part of their proceedings?
Well, no, we don't have any information on that. But we do have an indication that the bridegroom and the bride chamber was very important in these rituals. And so, and you get this idea from the sun and the moon meeting each other in a celestial marriage in the heavens above, that this idea, the idea of the sacred marriage was central to these rites. And so you could imagine that they would have something to do with not exactly a sacred frenzy, but at least a sacred marriage between the king and the queen, so that this marriage had to be consummated, not only to preserve the royal family, but to preserve the lands. It's a central theme of Arthurian legend that because the king had been castrated, he was wounded between the thighs, that the land had become a wasteland. Now that is looking at this tradition from, I think, the opposite point of view. That's looking at this tradition from the Roman point of view, I think, where they're looking at this tradition and saying, well, you lost the Jewish revolt and your lands became a wasteland because of this castration cult that you're a part of. So yeah, I think that's the opposite view of the benefits of this this cult.
And you have a brilliant example in Elagabalus as well. I think they should have put a stipulation underneath getting castrated. It's like, don't do it too young. Because I think we're starting to understand why Elagabalus was such a madman now, in the kind of culture that he grew up with.
Yeah, I mean, yes, he was slightly off his rocker. He didn't know how to run an empire, and this is always the problem. If you are too certain, perhaps, about your belief systems, and you're working to some sort of higher goal, which is outside the realms of the actual empire and the people, you're probably not going to be a very good emperor. And so Elagabalus was regarded as a very poor emperor, and he only lasted 4 years and he was murdered. Whereas someone like Vespasian, who was a commoner and an army commander, a tax collector, he understood the ways of the world. He was regarded as one of the best emperors that Rome ever had, because he knew how to run an organization, the empire. And so, yeah, sometimes these highly religious people are not very good at running empires, and the empire collapses. And that's certainly true of Elagabalus. He was not very good at it.
Very fortunate for us that he made such a scene. We can track his movements and what he was up to, and also his iconography, which has been very helpful in your study, right?
Yeah, because he gives us a parallel to the sort of Edessan story, because we don't have much information about the Edessans because it was all destroyed, because as we said at the beginning of this talk, the Romans excised them from history. They were completely deleted from history, so we don't know very much about them. But we do know more about the Edessans, because 2 or 3 of their kings became emperor. And so we've got much more information about this monarchy, which is a parallel monarchy to the Edessan monarchy, and it gives us a good idea of how they would have operated, what they believed in, and everything else.
And there, sorry, I was just gonna. I didn't mean to cut you off there. But were you going to finish your story about how they rebuilt the Duat zodiac, and that there was some Omessan links there?
Yes. You mean the Temple of the Zodiac in Diva?
Yes.
Yes, it was rebuilt in the early 3rd century, in say 225, 228 or something AD, because that's when Elagabalus was murdered. And so they had the same situation again, exactly the same situation. So in the 1st century, AD 70, they had had a battle with the Edessan monarchy and taken them into custody, put them into house arrest in Fortress Diva, where they built this temple to the zodiac. Then in the 3rd century with Elagabalus, they had exactly the same situation again, because the same, as it were, people, the Emessans this time, not the Edessans, they had been defeated. Elagabalus had been murdered, but no doubt all of his entourage, all of his aristocrats and so on, they all had to be dealt with, and Rome had to do something with these people. And it looks like they did exactly the same as they did with the Edessans. Instead of just killing them, they thought, well, what can we do with these people? We've got this fortress still sitting there. 120 years later, we've got this fortress still sitting there. We know why we built this fortress. We can reuse it. And so we can send all of these people who we don't want associated with Rome, because Elagabalus really was not terribly popular. We can just send them all across to Fortress Diva. And we can sit them there, incarcerate them. And if they want to go and make another temple to the zodiac, well, that's okay by us. As long as they're happy and they sit there and they die there, we'll be very happy chaps. So they remade a brand new fortress, brand new temple of the zodiac in Fortress Diva, just after Elagabalus died. And we know this because underneath the 2nd temple, which was built on top of the first, they didn't even destroy the foundations to the 1st temple. They just leveled the site and rebuilt the new temple on top of the old one. And underneath the flagstones of the 2nd temple, they found a coin of Elagabalus. So they know exactly when it was built.
Gotcha.
So the 2nd temple was a copy of the 1st temple.
Put that coin there intentionally?
It's possible, isn't it? It's quite possible, yeah. Like we do nowadays sometimes.
They tell you if you're chipping, if you're gonna make like arrowheads out of flint, you should bury the shavings with a coin, so archaeologists don't find it later and be like, "Hey, look, cavemen were here."
Yes, we found all of these. Found these ancient arrowheads with a coin of Abraham Lincoln. Oh, okay.
So going back to the original purpose of Fortress, sorry, what's the name of it again? Duat.
Well, the fortress didn't have a name. The fortress is called Diwa or Diva.
Diva.
Yes.
Okay. So this fortress, Diva, there really was a Jesus. And when William Blake said, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen," he actually meant the real Jesus. And this is the whole issue that surrounds the real anthem of England, which is William Blake's Jerusalem.
Yes, and the interesting thing there is, how much did he know about this? Because he's not talking about Joseph of Arimathea. Of course, the normal story is about Joseph of Arimathea coming to England. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the Holy Lamb of God. So he's talking about Jesus. And of course, I have linked this Edessan monarchy with the gospel story. We'll go into this later because it's very complicated. But I've ended up with this Edessan Jesus character, as it were, ending up in Fortress Diva in Chester in the 1st century. And so my history matches the hymn by William Blake perfectly. So the question is, what did William Blake know? Now, William Blake was a Freemason. We know that from the imagery that he draws. It's purely Masonic all the time. Now, how much did he know about this? Because within modern Masonry, I don't find anyone that knows this information. And okay, I'm not in Grand Lodge, but I've met Master Masons who have been through the chair at Grand Lodge, and they don't know anything about this. but it sort of looks as though William Blake did. And so I'm wondering where he got his information from and how much he knew. But yeah, you're right. That hymn matches this history perfectly, because the Jesus character was on England's pleasant lands scene, just as it says. He was incarcerated at Fortress Diva until his death in the AD 90s. So he'd have been quite old by the time he died. He would have been perhaps in his 80s or 90s. He would have been quite old. But he would have been buried there as well, because there's no way in the world that you would allow his ashes or his bones to be taken back to his power base back in Judea. That's just inviting trouble. You're inviting a new revolt against Rome if you do something like that. It's like Rudolf Hess. When he was captured, the last thing anybody wanted was anyone gathering around Rudolf Hess. And so he was kept in solitary confinement, just like these people in Fortress Diva, until the end of his days. And then his ashes were scattered somewhere in secret, so nobody could have a gathering place for Rudolf Hess's mortal remains. And for people who don't know, he was one of the leaders of the Nazi Party during the Second World War. So they did exactly the same there. And so the remains of these characters, the disciples and the Jesus character, the Edessan monarchy, would have been buried somewhere in Britain. So they would never go back to Judea. And the interesting, just maybe as a final point to finish this discussion, the interesting inference we get from Arthurian legend is that he was buried in Stonehenge, because Stonehenge was abandoned at this time. It was not a functioning. It had been stopped being a functioning temple when the Druids were all killed, which I think was in the early AD 60s when Rome defeated the Druids. I think that was the early AD 60s. And so ever since that time, Stonehenge had not been a functioning temple. It was abandoned. And so it would be a perfect location to bury the remains of someone who was important, who needed perhaps a little bit of dignity, but in no fashion could ever have his remains go back to Judea, and to be somewhere roughly in sort of secret as well. Don't know. I mean, it's a complete guesstimate, but that might be where he ended up.
Involving the Welsh or some locals to carry out that function, because prisoners wouldn't be allowed to even leave the prison to go to Stonehenge to do that. So maybe they worked out arrangement with the guards, the Roman guards, and had some contacts with the Welsh over there who might have been sympathetic, and the Celts or whatever might have volunteered for that. How would they arrange that is kind of what I'm asking. What would be the implications of being able to arrange that?
Well, I think you're probably right. The people incarcerated there wouldn't be allowed out of the prison. It would be arranged by the jailers, or as you say, you know, some sympathetic locals maybe, who knew about this story. Stonehenge was well known by the Romans because a Roman road goes right next door to it. So certainly the Romans knew about the site. They would have known that it was abandoned. And they could have given, you know, just a little bit of dignity to the to this event, you know, as being an end of an era, you know, send this guy on his way, much like we did with Napoleon. I'll have to read up actually how he was eventually buried, but I'm pretty sure his remains were not allowed to go back to France. I'll have to read up on that. I imagine he was buried on St. Helena to keep him away from the French. Yeah, it's interesting to speculate. I mean, this is all speculation because we don't know, we don't have the information. But it ties in with the history we know of that particular fortress. It all ties in that we have these two monarchies from the same region who were both defeated by Rome, and both may well have ended up at this particular fortress, and both making temples of the zodiac using Egyptian royal cubits and so on. It fits that situation very well.
Well, Ralph, let me just say, eureka! You know, what a discovery, what a podcast, what an introduction to your work. Truly, we've had a man of massive renown on this show, and I'm really happy to have you here. Caleb, is there anything else?
I'm glad we were able to talk to you today, and this is going to be a reference work of mine. I'm probably going to use this video just as a study guide at this point.
Yes. It's good, isn't it? It's interesting information because it's fresh, it's new. Nobody has been through this story in this fashion before, and it sort of makes sense. It's not just off the wall links between people. It's a story that makes sense. I liken it to a jigsaw puzzle. If you had random pieces and you were trying to make a jigsaw puzzle, they just would not fit together. But in this scenario, all of the links, all of the history that I'm teasing out of these texts, it all fits together into one nice big story, even though some pieces are missing because, of course, we have a fragmentary history. We don't have the full picture, but all of the pieces that we are putting together all fit together and make one cohesive story, one cohesive history of this era. It sort of looks like a real history, and it sounds like a real history. And so I think it is. It's a much more believable story than the classical history we have of this region. And it doesn't change the story much. So, you know, people who are religious, the story remains the same. Okay, these people are elevated maybe a little bit from shepherds and pauper princes of peace. They're elevated into kings and queens and more influential people, aristocrats. Apart from that, the story remains the same. But of course, stories are made about kings and queens. They're not made about shepherds. We don't make stories about shepherds. We don't make stories about carpenters. We make stories about kings, queens, and Freemasons.
It should be a win for them to find out that their pauper was actually a king, but some twisted logic, they think that that's worse because it means they were less spiritual.
Even though he was called a king, you know, he was called a king on 36 occasions within the New Testament, and yet they still won't believe that. So, yeah, that's the conundrum.
Yeah, this is great. It was great to talk to you. Hopefully we can have you back at some point.
Yeah, there's a lot more to go through. It's a big, long history that encompasses all of that story and more beyond, because we can go into Arthurian legend and various other bits and so on. But yeah, I'm sure we'll be back and do another.
If anyone wants to check out, and I strongly recommend that you do, you check out Ralph Ellis's lectures on his channel, Ralph Ellis, just to give, if you're like me and you learn more from that kind of method through lectures and visual displays. I found them extremely helpful. I also suggest that you check out the rest of Ralph Ellis's work, pick up his books, Jesus, King of Edessa, Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, Cleopatra the Christ, The Grail Cipher, and many more whenever they pick up your interest. Ralph, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today, and I cannot wait to speak to you again.
And just very quickly on those books, most of them are available on Amazon now as paperback or as ebooks. Do try and get the 2017 and later editions, because I've put some updated editions there. There are some knocking around Amazon, which are old copies, and I don't know why they're still running around Amazon, but they are. But 2017 and later editions are much better, and they should be a part of a series. So they should be a part of a 4-part or a 5-part series is one way of knowing if they are the latest versions or not. So do look at that. My Facebook site is also fairly active, which is ralphellis.144 is my Facebook site. And yeah, there's a lot of commentary on there, which is always good fun. We have a bit of a knockabout.
That's fantastic. I'll be checking out that Facebook page. Definitely. All right, guys. Thank you very much. This has been the Novocastrian Presents. Thank you very much. I'll speak to you again.
Thank you.